Hi guys, tonight we're going to explore the complete story of the Comanche Warriors and the vast world that existed before their power reached its height. You find yourself beneath an enormous sky, where grass rolls toward horizons that seem impossibly distant. Wind bends the prairie in long waves, while somewhere beyond your sight, horses move through the gathering darkness. Their hooves strike dry earth softly at first, then gather into a deep rhythm beneath the open sky. This landscape will become the heart of one of the most powerful native societies in North American history. Yet the Comanche world you recognize does not simply appear fully formed upon these plains. It grows through movement, adaptation, family decisions, trade, conflict, and one extraordinary animal that changes almost everything. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, tell us where you're listening from and your local time tonight. It is always fascinating to imagine people hearing the same story beneath completely different skies. Now dim the lights. Your mind drifts toward the western interior of North America during the early 18th century. There are no highways crossing these plains. Naturally, and absolutely no convenient roadside stops serving tired travelers. Instead, immense stretches of grassland rise toward mountains, river valleys, wooded streams, and dry plateaus. The people who become known as the Comanche emerge from communities historically connected with the Shoshone peoples farther north and west. Modern historians generally place this separation and southward movement around the late 17th and early 18th centuries. The precise timing remains uncertain, because written outsiders recorded only fragments of a much larger indigenous history. That uncertainty matters. Researchers associated with major institutions, including the University of Oklahoma and other American universities studying Western history, have emphasized the importance of horses in this transformation. The historical evidence broadly supports a powerful connection between mounted mobility and the emergence of distinctive Comanche communities on the plains. Yet historians still debate exactly how quickly that transformation occurred and how deliberately different groups moved southward. Written records were produced mostly by outsiders, while Comanche historical knowledge followed different traditions of memory and transmission. So you should picture movement rather than a sudden migration marked neatly upon a paper map. Families travel in groups across demanding country, carrying possessions while watching weather, water, animals, and neighboring communities. Children grow accustomed to horizons that constantly change, while adults measure distance through practical knowledge rather than numbered road signs. At night, wood smoke settles close to the ground. Someone repairs clothing beside a small fire while another person checks animals beyond the glow. A tired child falls asleep beneath warm hides, hearing quiet conversation and horses shifting somewhere in the darkness. These ordinary moments matter because warrior societies are never composed only of warriors. Behind every mounted fighter stands a network of parents, children, hunters, craft workers, traders, elders, and relatives. The horse gradually changes what those families can accomplish. Horses descended from animals introduced into the Americas by Europeans spread through trade, capture, exchange, and reproduction. By the early 18th century, mounted life is transforming communities across portions of the Western Plains. For the developing Comanche world, the consequences become especially profound. A person traveling on foot must think carefully about distance, weight, water, and available food. A skilled rider can cover greater distances while carrying supplies and responding quickly to changing conditions. The plains suddenly become different. Buffalo herds that once demanded exhausting approaches can now be pursued with extraordinary mobility. Camps can move more efficiently, possessions can increase, and hunting territories can expand across wider landscapes. You can almost feel wet leather beneath your fingers as equipment is adjusted before departure. Horsey breath hangs briefly in cold morning air while riders examine the horizon for movement. Learning to ride begins early. Children growing within increasingly mounted communities develop balance and confidence that astonish many later outside observers. Riding becomes more than transportation, because knowledge of horses becomes woven into work, status, hunting, diplomacy, and warfare. Still, there's nothing inevitable about Comanche dominance. The southern plains already contain powerful peoples with their own territories, alliances, enemies, and economic interests. Apache communities hold important positions across broad regions, while Pueblo settlements connect agricultural production with established trading networks farther west. Spanish colonial settlements also push influence northward from New Mexico and other frontier districts. Their officials possess metal weapons, livestock, fortified communities, and access to imperial resources, although those advantages are often limited by distance. The region therefore resembles a shifting web rather than an empty frontier awaiting occupation. You hear languages changing from one trading place to another, although their exact words disappear from our narration tonight. Goods move between communities even when political relationships remain uncertain or openly hostile. A horse may change owners several times across enormous distances. Metal tools, hides, food, weapons, and information follow equally complicated routes. The people becoming Comanche learn within this environment. They observe landscapes carefully, recognizing river crossings, grazing areas, shelter, seasonal weather, and places where buffalo gather. Such knowledge cannot be learned from a single journey, because survival depends upon repeated experience. The plains reward mobility, but they punish mistakes. A storm can turn warmth into dangerous cold within hours. Summer heat can exhaust animals, while scarce water forces travelers toward predictable rivers and springs. For a moment, it feels as though the landscape itself is teaching strategy. You begin understanding why mobility becomes inseparable from security. A community capable of moving rapidly can approach resources, avoid stronger enemies, pursue opportunities, and choose a favorable ground. This flexibility gradually encourages a political world that outsiders sometimes misunderstand. Comanche society does not develop as one centralized kingdom commanded by a permanent supreme ruler. Communities organize through interconnected local groups, extended families, respected leaders, and shifting relationships shaped by circumstance. Leadership depends heavily upon reputation and persuasion. A successful leader needs people willing to follow rather than subjects who simply receive commands. Hunting skill, generosity, judgment, diplomacy, courage, and family connections can all influence standing. That structure provides remarkable adaptability. One group can make choices appropriate to its immediate circumstances without waiting for orders traveling across hundreds of miles. Yet relationships between groups preserve broader cultural connections that become increasingly important as Comanche influence expands. Historical records from the early 18th century begin revealing that expansion more clearly. Spanish observers gradually recognize mounted groups moving southward and interacting with communities around New Mexico and the plains. Their reports are imperfect, sometimes confused, and often shaped by colonial fears. Modern scholars therefore compare those documents carefully with archaeology, geography, indigenous traditions, and later historical evidence. Researchers at institutions such as Yale, Harvard, and the University of Chicago have helped strengthen broader scholarship concerning Native history by treating indigenous societies as active political powers. That perspective changes what you see. You're not watching people simply reacting to European expansion. You're watching communities making strategic decisions within a world containing several competing centers of power. Some choices involve trade. Others involve hunting territory, family security, alliances, retaliation, or access to horses. A decision made beside one quiet campfire can eventually influence relationships hundreds of miles away. The emotional landscape changes with these possibilities. Uncertainty begins giving way to confidence as mounted experience accumulates across generations. Young riders inherit skills their grandparents may have learned only after horses entered their world. Knowledge becomes deeper. The animal beneath a rider is no longer merely useful property. Horses increasingly shape how distance feels, how wealth is measured, and how danger can be approached or escaped. You look across the grass again. Buffalo darken a distant slope, appearing almost like moving earth beneath the afternoon light. Riders wait rather than rushing forward because patience remains part of survival. Behind them, families prepare for another movement across country that outsiders will eventually describe with borders and names. Those future lines do not yet control the horizon. The 18th century is still young. Comanche power has not reached its famous height, and many difficult struggles remain ahead. Yet the essential foundations are becoming visible beneath the quiet rhythm of mounted life. Movement creates opportunity. Family networks preserve knowledge, while horses expand the physical scale upon which that knowledge can operate. The southern plains are beginning to open before people increasingly capable of mastering their enormous distances, and somewhere in that widening world, a child grips a horse with practiced knees and follows older riders across the grass. The moment appears ordinary to everyone nearby. History will make it extraordinary. The child you watched riding across the grass grows within a world increasingly measured by hoofbeats. What once seemed like an extraordinary advantage gradually becomes the foundation of everyday Comanche life. Horses are changing movement, hunting, wealth, relationships, and warfare at the same time. You feel that transformation most clearly when camp begins moving before sunrise. The air remains cold enough that every horse sends pale breath into the morning darkness. Families tighten leather straps, gather bundles, secure sleeping hides, and prepare children for another journey across open country. There is no frantic rush. Experienced travelers understand that animals must be handled carefully, because the entire community increasingly depends upon them. A weakened horse can mean slower movement, lost hunting opportunities, or dangerous vulnerability far from reliable shelter. As daylight spreads, the camp stretches across the prairie. Some riders travel ahead, watching the country for buffalo, strangers, water, or approaching weather. Others remain close to families and heavily loaded animals moving steadily behind them. The horse has expanded their practical geography. Places once separated by exhausting journeys can now become connected within seasonal patterns of movement. Rivers, grazing grounds, hunting areas, trading places, and sheltered camps form a mental landscape remembered through repeated travel. Modern historical scholarship consistently identifies mounted mobility as central to the remarkable Comanche expansion of the 18th century. Researchers studying Native North American history at institutions including Yale and the University of Chicago have placed this transformation within a wider continental story. Horses do not merely make existing life faster, they help create something different. Still, historians debate exactly when particular Comanche groups acquired large horse herds and how rapidly mounted practices spread between families. Early colonial reports remain uneven, while archaeological evidence cannot always reveal the social meaning attached to individual animals. What survives clearly is the scale of the transformation. You notice it first during the buffalo hunt. Ahead of you, the grass appears strangely dark beneath a pale afternoon sky. Then the darkness moves, separating into hundreds and eventually thousands of massive animals crossing the plains. The ground seems almost alive. Riders approach carefully because buffalo are powerful. Unpredictable animals rather than convenient supplies waiting patiently for human hunters. Wind direction matters, as does terrain, horse condition, experience, and the behavior of the herd. A skilled hunting horse becomes immensely valuable. The animal must respond quickly while remaining close enough for the rider to hunt effectively. One mistake beside a frightened buffalo can injure horse and rider within seconds. You hear hooves pounding dry soil. Dust rises around moving animals, catching sunlight until the entire landscape becomes hazy and golden. Riders disappear briefly inside it before emerging again beside the running herd. Success means far more than meat. Buffalo provide hides for shelter and clothing, along with materials used for containers, tools, bedding, and other necessities. Processing the animals requires demanding labor that continues long after the excitement of the hunt disappears. Back at camp, intimate routines resume. Hands work carefully across hides, while children watch techniques they will eventually learn themselves. Someone tends a cooking fire, and the smell of wood smoke settles among shelters as evening approaches. The horse stands behind much of this abundance. Mounted hunters can pursue herds more efficiently, while communities can transport larger quantities of useful materials afterward. Greater carrying capacity allows families to possess goods that would have been burdensome during purely pedestrian movement. Comfort remains relative, naturally. Nobody is loading a travelling wardrobe onto a wagon simply because horses have improved transportation. Every possession still competes with practical limits imposed by distance, weather, animal strength, and seasonal movement. Yet material life can become richer. More hides can be transported, larger shelters become practical, and trade goods can travel between distant communities. Horse ownership itself increasingly becomes an important measure of wealth. A prosperous family may possess many animals serving different purposes. Some horses are suited for hunting, while others carry people, equipment, or household possessions. Particularly fast or dependable animals can acquire exceptional value because their abilities directly influence survival and prestige. With wealth comes responsibility. Animals require grass, water, protection, and constant attention. Large herds can become difficult to conceal and extremely attractive to anyone interested in stealing them. This produces an uncomfortable truth. The horse strengthens Comanche society while simultaneously encouraging new forms of conflict. Raiding for horses becomes increasingly important across the wider plains and borderlands. A successful raid can transform a family's circumstances. Several captured horses might increase transportation, hunting capacity, trading opportunities, and social standing. A failed expedition can bring grief into a lodge where someone waits for a rider who never returns. The emotional distance between prosperity and loss becomes painfully small. For young men seeking recognition, skill with horses therefore carries meaning beyond ordinary riding. Courage, judgment, endurance, and the ability to manage animals under pressure can strengthen a person's reputation. Warriors learn to use mounted speed with remarkable effectiveness. Later observers often describe Comanche riders performing difficult maneuvers while traveling rapidly across uneven ground. Such accounts sometimes contain exaggeration, yet the broader historical evidence leaves little doubt about exceptional equestrian skill. That skill begins with familiarity rather than magic. Imagine spending much of childhood around animals whose moods, strengths, and movements become almost instinctively recognizable. You learn how a horse shifts its weight before turning and how exhaustion changes its breathing. Your hands understand reins before adulthood. Your legs develop balance through thousands of ordinary hours rather than one dramatic lesson. By the time dangerous riding becomes necessary, the underlying movements have already become deeply familiar. This is where warfare begins changing. A mounted warrior can approach rapidly, strike under favorable circumstances, and withdraw before slower opponents organize an effective response. Speed becomes particularly useful across landscapes offering enormous room for maneuver, but mobility does not mean constant attack. Knowing when not to fight can be equally important. Comanche groups can avoid unfavorable confrontations, abandon temporary camps, scatter when necessary, and reunite after danger passes. Their political flexibility complements their physical mobility in ways centralized opponents sometimes find frustrating. Spanish colonial authorities gradually confront this reality. Soldiers operating from fixed settlements must protect specific places, supply routes, livestock, and civilian populations. Their horses require food, while military expeditions consume supplies that must often travel considerable distances. Comanche riders face logistical limits too, but their communities understand the plains through everyday experience. Water is remembered. Shelter is remembered. Seasonal grazing is remembered. A river crossing is not merely a mark on paper, because families know what its banks become after heavy rain. They remember where animals can descend safely and where mud can trap exhausted horses. Such environmental knowledge becomes strategic power. Prestigious American universities studying environmental and Western history have increasingly emphasized this relationship between ecology and human decision-making. Power on the plains cannot be understood solely by counting weapons or warriors. Grass matters, rain matters, buffalo matter. Above all, healthy horses matter. Your mind drifts toward an evening camp after another long movement. Saddles and equipment are checked while animals graze beyond the shelters beneath a cooling sky. A parent examines a child's scraped hand after an awkward dismount. The injury is small, producing more embarrassment than pain, and quiet laughter soon replaces concern. Such moments keep the larger story human. The celebrated mounted warrior exists because generations of ordinary people feed animals, teach children, repair equipment, preserve routes, prepare food, and remember where water can be found. Horse culture therefore reshapes relationships inside the community as thoroughly as warfare outside it. People responsible for processing buffalo products contribute directly to growing trade and household prosperity. Herd management requires coordinated labor, while moving camp demands decisions involving families rather than isolated warriors. The plains become a shared working environment. As darkness deepens, horses remain audible beyond the firelight. You hear occasional movement through grass and the soft sound of the leather equipment being placed aside. The world feels wider now. Distances that once separated opportunities are becoming corridors through which skilled riders can travel. Buffalo hunting produces resources. Horses create mobility, and mobility opens new possibilities for exchange and expansion. Yet every advantage creates another question. Where will those horses carry their riders next? The answer waits farther south, where broad grasslands, established communities, Spanish settlements, and contested hunting grounds are drawing Comanche families toward an increasingly important new homeland. Those horses now carry families farther south, where the grasslands widen beneath an almost unreasonable amount of sky. The journey is not a single organized march, and no leader points toward a distant horizon, announcing a permanent destination. Movement happens gradually, through hunting, opportunity, conflict, kinship, and decisions made by separate groups across many seasons. You travel through country where the Rocky Mountains influence rivers flowing toward enormous interior plains. Cottonwoods gather along waterways, while open grassland stretches between them in distances difficult to judge. A ridge can look close, then you ride toward it for hours. This physical scale helps explain why mounted mobility becomes so decisive during the early 18th century. Comanche communities can move through landscapes where controlling every mile with permanent settlements would be extraordinarily difficult. Their southward expansion increasingly brings them into territories associated with Apache communities. That relationship becomes central to the emerging balance of power. Before Comanche dominance develops across much of the southern plains, various Apache groups already occupy or use extensive territories there. They hunt buffalo, trade with neighboring peoples, and maintain relationships with Spanish settlements in New Mexico. The arrival of increasingly mobile Comanche groups adds another powerful competitor. Historical records from New Mexico begin noticing these changes during the early 18th century. Spanish officials hear reports of mounted newcomers, shifting alliances, attacks, and growing pressure upon communities connected to their frontier settlements. These records provide valuable evidence, but they require caution. Colonial writers often viewed native politics through Spanish strategic concerns and sometimes misunderstood relationships between different communities. Modern historians therefore compare surviving reports with broader archaeological, environmental, and indigenous evidence. Scholarship associated with universities such as Oxford, Cambridge, and the University of New Mexico has contributed to a wider understanding of borderlands as contested spaces, rather than seeing one expanding empire confronting passive inhabitants. Historians increasingly describe several political worlds interacting simultaneously. You can sense that complexity beside a river crossing. One group approaching from the distance might represent trading partners, relatives, competitors, or enemies. The answer can depend upon events that occurred months earlier and hundreds of miles away. Information therefore carries enormous value. Riders returning from distant journeys bring knowledge about buffalo herds, settlements, horse populations, military movements, and possible trading opportunities. Their observations help families decide where movement is worth the risk. The southern plains offer powerful attractions. Large buffalo populations support mobile hunting communities, while grasslands provide grazing for expanding horse herds. Rivers create natural corridors across otherwise exposed country and offer wood, water, and seasonal shelter. Yet abundance invites competition. Comanche expansion contributes to sustained conflict with Apache groups across portions of the plains. Over time, pressure helps push some Apache communities southward and westward, while changing their relationships with Spanish authorities. This process unfolds unevenly. There is no afternoon when everyone wakes and discovers that an entire region has changed owners. Control on the plains depends upon repeated use, hunting access, military strength, diplomacy, and the ability to return season after season. Your ears catch distant thunder. Clouds gather over the western horizon while riders search for a suitable campsite near protected ground. Wind suddenly carries the smell of rain across grass that had been dry moments earlier. Families begin working quickly. Shelters must withstand the approaching weather. Horses need attention, and loose possessions become troublesome when prairie wind decides to demonstrate its personality. Rain reaches camp hard. Water strikes hides and darkens the soil while children remain close to adults beneath shelter. Wet leather smells sharp in the enclosed space, and someone quietly rearranges bedding away from a persistent leak. Nothing about regional expansion removes these ordinary difficulties. Power still depends upon surviving weather, keeping animals healthy, finding food, raising children, and maintaining relationships within the community. Grand historical maps often make expansion appear cleaner than lived experience ever feels. After the storm, the country changes. Water shines across shallow depressions, and evening sunlight breaks beneath retreating clouds. Horses graze on wet grass while steam rises faintly from their warming backs. Movement continues as Comanche communities become increasingly established farther south. They encounter another important native power, the Ute people. Relationships between Comanche and Ute groups shift between cooperation and conflict during this period. Early alliances can assist movement and warfare, but alliances are rarely permanent on an 18th century frontier shaped by changing economic interests, access to horses, trade routes, hunting territories, and relationships with Spanish settlements can transform yesterday's partner into tomorrow's rival. Historians still debate aspects of these changing relationships because surviving accounts are incomplete and frequently written from outside perspectives. No clear agreement survives regarding the motives behind every alliance, separation, or local confrontation. That ambiguity is worth preserving. People living through these events do not possess a historian's finished timeline. They make decisions with partial information, personal memories, family obligations, and immediate concerns. Imagine an elder studying strangers approaching camp. Perhaps earlier encounters with their relatives were peaceful. Perhaps another family remembers stolen horses, an insult, or a death that still demands careful negotiation, the decision cannot be reduced to a coloured arrow on a map. Comanche political organisation allows considerable flexibility in such circumstances. Local groups can respond to conditions without requiring approval from a single centralised authority. This becomes one source of resilience. Spanish officials sometimes struggle to understand whom they must negotiate with, because agreements involving one Comanche group may not automatically bind another. European diplomatic expectations often assume political structures more centralised than those operating across the plains. To Comanche communities, flexibility makes practical sense. A family living hundreds of miles from another group faces different neighbours, grazing conditions, opportunities and threats. Local leadership therefore remains connected to practical influence and reputation. Successful leaders persuade. Generosity matters because wealth circulated through relationships can strengthen loyalty and respect. Courage matters, but reckless behaviour that endangers relatives is not necessarily useful leadership. Judgment matters even more. The warrior emerging within this society is therefore not simply someone who charges dramatically toward danger. He must understand horses, terrain, timing, human behaviour, and the complicated consequences of violence. Sometimes the strongest decision is withdrawal. A smaller group noticing a superior enemy can disappear across open country before a confrontation develops. Mounted mobility allows distance itself to become defensive space. Other times, speed permits sudden concentration. Riders separated across the landscape can gather for a specific purpose, creating temporary strength before dispersing again. This makes Comanche military activity difficult for settled opponents to predict. By the middle decades of the 18th century, these patterns are reshaping the southern plains. Apache power has not disappeared, and Spanish influence remains important around New Mexico and northern settlements. Yet Comanche communities are increasingly difficult to treat as temporary newcomers. They are becoming rooted through movement. That sounds contradictory until you experience the plains. Home does not need to mean one permanent building standing on one permanent field. Home can be a network of familiar rivers, hunting grounds, campsites, trails, grazing areas, and remembered horizons. Children learn these places through repetition. A particular bend in a river becomes associated with good grazing. A sheltered valley recalls an old winter camp, while another location carries memories of relatives no longer alive. Landscape becomes biography. You ride through evening light as long shadows stretch from horses across the grass. Somewhere nearby, a young person listens while an older relative explains a route toward water beyond the next ridge. That knowledge may save lives years later. Historical expansion is built from thousands of such transmissions. By establishing themselves across increasingly broad southern territories, Comanche communities gain access to buffalo, horses, trade, and strategic routes connecting different borderlands. Spanish settlements now lie within reach of expanding networks, so do communities farther south. The consequences will eventually extend across enormous portions of what becomes Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado. Yet those modern boundaries would mean little to the riders crossing the 18th century plains. They understand rivers and distances instead. They understand where buffalo move. They understand where horses thrive. Most importantly, they are learning that controlling movement can matter more than permanently occupying every piece of ground. The emotional transition is subtle but profound. You began among communities moving toward new possibilities. Now you find people increasingly confident that these southern grasslands can sustain a distinctive way of life. The plains no longer feel unfamiliar. They are becoming remembered country. Night settles gently over another camp, bringing cooler air and the smell of damp earth. Horses stand beyond the fading fire while families rest after another day of movement. Tomorrow they may travel again, but movement no longer means searching without belonging. Through repeated journeys, hunting, conflict, alliance, memory, and family life, a homeland is taking shape beneath their horses, And within that homeland, the warrior world itself is becoming more complex. That growing homeland is held together not by stone walls or a royal capital, but by relationships. Families move across the plains carrying memory, obligation, reputation, and practical knowledge wherever their horses take them. To understand the warriors who emerge from this world, you first have to understand the society surrounding them. Morning begins quietly inside camp. Smoke rises from small fires and hangs low before the warming air carries it away. Someone checks a hide covering while another person walks toward horses grazing beyond the sleeping area. Children begin stirring among blankets. A mother adjusts clothing around a sleepy child before returning to the work already waiting nearby. There are meals to prepare, animals to manage, equipment to repair, and plans to discuss before anyone travels. These scenes rarely dominate military histories, yet they form the foundation beneath everything that later makes Comanche warriors famous. A fighter cannot remain mounted without horses, and horses cannot remain useful without people constantly caring for them. Comanche society during the 18th century consists of interconnected local communities rather than one centralized political state. Families and extended kin networks form the strongest everyday bonds, while larger groups cooperate for hunting, defense, trade, ceremonies, and warfare. Modern historians studying the native plains broadly agree that this decentralized organization should not be confused with disorder. Scholars at institutions including the University of Oklahoma and Yale have emphasized how native political systems could function through flexible networks rather than centralized governments. That distinction is essential. European observers often searched for kings because kings made diplomacy wonderfully convenient for imperial administrators. Find one ruler, obtain one agreement, and perhaps everyone supposedly obeys. The plains refuse to cooperate with that expectation. A respected Comanche leader can influence others through ability, generosity, experience, family connections, and persuasive judgment. His authority usually depends upon maintaining confidence rather than commanding permanent obedience. People can disagree. Families can choose different courses when circumstances demand them. Groups can cooperate closely during one period and operate more independently during another. Such flexibility becomes useful across enormous territory. Imagine two communities separated by several days of riding. One faces pressure near Spanish settlements while another follows buffalo across distant grasslands. Their immediate needs are different. A rigid political structure could become slow and cumbersome across those distances. Local decision-making allows people to respond rapidly to weather, enemies, trade opportunities, and changing buffalo movements. Still, historians debate how outsiders should describe these political relationships. Terms such as band, division, nation, and confederacy can impose categories that do not perfectly match historical Comanche understandings. Surviving written accounts often simplify arrangements that changed over time. No single description solves everything. You are better served imagining overlapping circles of obligation and cooperation, expanding outward from households toward wider networks. Kinship creates connections capable of crossing substantial distances. Marriage can strengthen those connections. So can exchange, shared hunting, friendship, diplomacy, and mutual defense. A warrior's identity therefore develops inside relationships rather than through individual achievement alone. Reputation certainly matters. A young man may desire recognition for courage, horsemanship, generosity, or success during dangerous expeditions. Yet returning with resources useful to relatives can matter as much as personal display. Horses become especially significant. Owning many animals can increase a household's mobility and economic security. Giving horses away can also demonstrate generosity, transforming material wealth into social respect. Wealth moves through people. That pattern surprises anyone imagining status purely as accumulation. A respected person can strengthen influence by distributing valuable possessions and supporting relatives when circumstances become difficult. The evening after a successful hunt reveals this social world clearly. The smell of cooking meat spreads through camp while conversations rise around separate fires. Children drift between relatives, carrying small tasks and collecting whatever interesting information adults accidentally reveal. Someone laughs nearby. Another person remains quiet because a relative is absent on a distant journey. Happiness and worry occupy the same camp without requiring anyone to announce the contradiction. Warriors live inside that emotional landscape. Before leaving on an expedition, a rider understands that other people will wait for his return. His absence changes the labor available to his household and exposes loved ones to uncertainty. Courage, therefore, has consequences. The image of a fearless warrior can hide something more human. Fear is useful when it encourages preparation, careful scouting, and respect for dangerous opponents. Experienced fighters learn patience. They examine tracks, weather, horse condition, terrain, and the likely intentions of strangers. They know that spectacular bravery becomes considerably less impressive when it leaves your family without a dependable provider. Your mind drifts toward a young rider preparing equipment before dawn. His fingers tighten a leather strap and test it twice, nearby. An older relative notices the movement but says nothing because instruction does not always require another speech. The leather feels stiff from cold. A horse shifts beneath the rider's hand, impatient to move, somewhere beyond camp. Another animal calls softly through the darkness. Knowledge passes through observation. Children watch adults handle horses, prepare food, process hides, identify tracks, and judge weather. They learn where responsibility begins long before they possess adult authority. Different people develop specialized skills. Women perform vital work sustaining households, processing buffalo products, maintaining shelters, preparing food, and managing possessions during movement. Their labor contributes directly to the economic strength created through hunting and trade. Historical accounts produced by outsiders sometimes minimize this contribution. Modern scholarship has increasingly corrected that imbalance by examining household production and family networks alongside warfare. Research at major American universities has helped broaden Plains history beyond battles and military campaigns. When you restore that wider perspective, Comanche power looks different. A buffalo hide becomes more than evidence of successful hunting. It represents skilled processing, transportation, preservation, and eventually perhaps trade. A horse herd represents more than captured wealth. Someone must guard those animals through darkness, locate grazing, find water, treat injuries, and notice signs of exhaustion before a problem becomes disastrous. Power is labor made visible. The environment constantly reminds you of this fact. Summer brings heat that dries shallow water sources and leaves dust along skin and clothing. Winter can drive cold winds across exposed grassland without offering much sympathy for heroic reputations. Families adapt their movements accordingly. Seasonal decisions involve buffalo locations, grazing conditions, available water, security, and relationships with neighboring communities. Knowledge of these patterns becomes another form of inherited wealth. The warrior learns them too. Knowing a distant river valley can provide water may determine whether a raiding party returns safely. Understanding where grass remains available can preserve horses after a demanding journey. Environmental knowledge supports military knowledge. So does diplomacy. Comanche communities increasingly participate in complex relationships with other native peoples and colonial settlements. Trade can reduce hostility, create useful partnerships, or simply provide practical benefits despite continuing suspicion. Peace and war are not always permanent categories. A community that fights one year may trade another year when interests change. Leaders capable of negotiating therefore become as important as those demonstrating courage in combat. This is not inconsistency. It is adaptation. For people living within unstable borderlands, refusing every compromise would be expensive. Permanent warfare consumes lives, horses, time, and resources that communities also need for hunting and family survival. You hear the camp settling as darkness arrives. The temperature falls quickly after sunset, and people draw hides closer around themselves. Wood smoke catches briefly in your throat before the wind shifts toward the river. Beyond the fires, horses continue grazing. Their presence connects nearly every part of this society. They carry hunters toward buffalo, families toward seasonal camps, traders toward distant markets, messengers toward allies, and warriors toward danger. Yet the horse alone creates nothing. Human relationships determine how its possibilities are used. By the middle 18th century, Comanche communities possess a combination that neighboring powers increasingly struggle to match. They have extraordinary mobility, deep environmental knowledge, decentralized leadership, extensive kinship networks, and growing access to valuable horses. Their warriors emerge from this structure. They do not stand outside society as a separate military class commanding everyone around them. They remain sons, husbands, brothers, fathers, relatives, hunters, traders, and members of communities whose survival shapes their decisions. That reality gives their warfare purpose. A rider may seek honor, certainly, but he also seeks horses, security, resources, revenge, influence, or protection for people whose faces he knows intimately. The distinction matters. It transforms warfare from endless dramatic spectacle into something more complicated and historically recognizable. Violence exists beside affection, calculation, humor, exhaustion, responsibility, and ordinary domestic life. For a moment, you listen only to the prairie wind. Somewhere in darkness, a horse stamps against the earth, someone turns beneath a hide near the dying fire, while a guard watches beyond the edge of camp. Tomorrow brings another hunt, another journey may follow, and when danger eventually appears across the horizon, the riders who respond will carry more than weapons. They carry the expectations of an entire social world, supported by families whose labor has made their mobility possible. Now those riders are becoming exceptionally skilled at using speed itself as a weapon. Speed now becomes something more than movement across the plains. In skilled hands, it becomes protection, surprise, communication, hunting ability, and military power. The Comanche warrior learns to make distance work for him, turning enormous stretches of grassland into an advantage rather than an obstacle. Before sunrise, several riders leave camp quietly. Their horses walk at first, conserving strength while darkness still hides the contours of the land. Cold air settles against exposed skin, and the faint smell of wet leather rises from riding equipment. Nobody speaks unnecessarily. The riders are not searching for a glorious battle beneath convenient morning light. They are gathering information, because knowing what waits beyond the horizon can matter more than courage. Scouting becomes essential. Tracks reveal how many animals have passed, their direction, and sometimes how recently they travelled. Disturbed grass, abandoned fires, broken vegetation, and distant dust can suggest human movement. A careless traveller leaves a story behind. Experienced scouts learn to read that story while also preventing enemies from easily reading their own. Their knowledge combines observation with long familiarity with local terrain. Modern historians generally regard Comanche mobility and horsemanship as central explanations for their 18th and 19th century military effectiveness. Scholarship in Western and Native history at universities including Yale, Stanford, and the University of Oklahoma repeatedly places mounted warfare within a larger system of environmental knowledge. The horse is important, but knowledge directs it. Later outside observers sometimes portray Comanche riders as almost naturally inseparable from their mounts. Such descriptions can become romantic exaggerations when repeated without examining the years of training behind the skill. Nothing happens naturally about mastering a horse. Children spend countless ordinary hours learning balance, timing, control, and confidence. By adulthood, accomplished riders can perform maneuvers that astonish people with less experience. That familiarity changes combat. A rider can accelerate rapidly, alter direction, withdraw, circle, or exploit gaps before a slower opponent understands what is happening against infantry. Distance can become especially frustrating, yet historians still debate individual battlefield descriptions preserved in frontier accounts. Some reports were written long after events, while others came from frightened witnesses whose ability to observe accurately was understandably imperfect. Accounts differ regarding specific maneuvers, numbers of warriors, and the exact sequence of many encounters. The broader pattern remains convincing. Comanche fighters become highly effective practitioners of mounted warfare adapted to open plains conditions. They usually seek advantages rather than treating battle as a test requiring equal conditions. Fairness is for games. Survival rewards something else. You feel the difference when the rider's heads suddenly stop near a low ridge. One man dismounts and moves carefully upward while the others remain below with the horses. The grass brushes against his legs. From the crest, he studies distant movement without exposing his entire body against the sky. Perhaps he sees buffalo, perhaps travellers, or perhaps nothing worth approaching. That pauses warfare too. Information allows a group to decide whether to continue, retreat, divide, or wait. A small party discovering stronger opponents can avoid contact rather than sacrifice itself unnecessarily. Mounted speed supports this caution. If discovered, riders can rapidly increase distance, provided their horses remain healthy and the terrain permits escape. Maintaining fresh animals therefore becomes part of strategy. A warrior cannot simply demand endless speed. Horses tire. They need water, grazing, and recovery. While rough ground can injure even an excellent animal, long expeditions require careful decisions about when to ride hard and when to conserve strength. This logistical discipline rarely appears in dramatic paintings, yet it determines what is possible. Some successful Comanche warriors maintain access to several horses, allowing them to use different animals for different purposes. Particularly valuable mounts may be reserved for hunting, rapid travel, or dangerous situations. Horse wealth therefore strengthens military capacity. It also creates tempting targets. Raiding for horses becomes a significant part of warfare throughout the plains and borderlands. Capturing animals can weaken an opponent while strengthening the successful raiders economically and militarily. A horse taken without a major confrontation can be more useful than a costly victory. That reality shapes tactics. Stealth often matters as much as fighting. Imagine riders approaching a distant settlement under darkness, moving slowly enough to reduce noise. Horse breath drifts into cold air while every unexpected sound seems absurdly loud. A leather strap creaks. Someone immediately stops. For several seconds, nothing moves except grass beneath the night wind. Then the group continues, patient enough to understand that one careless moment could ruin days of travel. Such expeditions demand endurance. Riders may travel considerable distances through country where water sources and safe resting places must be known beforehand. They carry limited supplies and depend upon experience to manage their animals. When fighting does occur, mobility encourages fluid tactics. Comanche warriors can approach from different directions, test defenses, retreat beyond effective range, and return when circumstances improve. Their opponents sometimes mistake withdrawal for defeat. That can become dangerous. A retreat may simply create distance, encourage pursuit, or move fighting toward more favorable ground. Mounted warriors capable of reversing direction quickly can punish anyone who follows without discipline. Spanish soldiers learn this problem repeatedly. European military traditions emphasize formations, command structures, and defending fixed settlements or routes. Those methods can work effectively under suitable conditions, but the open plains create unusual difficulties. A column of soldiers cannot defend every horizon. Supply animals slow movement, while unfamiliar terrain increases dependence upon guides and reliable water. Comanche riders can choose whether an encounter occurs at all. This freedom becomes a strategic advantage. Their weapons also evolve with changing access to trade. Bows remain highly effective from horseback in skilled hands. because they can be used rapidly without the complicated reloading requirements of early firearms. Guns increasingly enter plains warfare, but possession alone does not guarantee superiority. Weapons must fit circumstances. A firearm can provide range and force, yet ammunition is limited and maintenance matters. A bow is quiet, reusable when arrows can be recovered, and familiar through long practice. Comanche warriors adapt rather than worship one technology. They acquire metal tools, firearms, and other manufactured goods through trade, exchange, capture, and expanding frontier networks. Useful innovations become incorporated into existing skills. That flexibility reflects the society you have already encountered. There is no military academy distributing identical instructions across every camp. Knowledge travels through relatives, experienced warriors, observation, storytelling, and participation in actual expeditions. Young men learn gradually. A first journey may involve responsibilities far less dramatic than combat. Watching horses, carrying information, following experienced riders, and remaining alert can teach more than reckless attempts to prove bravery. Reputation develops over time. Success may bring respect, especially when a warrior demonstrates courage and judgment. Generosity after returning can convert captured wealth into stronger social relationships. Failure carries emotional weight. A rider returning without a companion must eventually approach the family waiting in camp. No tactical explanation can remove the empty place beside a fire. The mood changes quietly. Celebration disappears, replaced by exhausted silence and grief shared through relationships extending across the community. Warfare is never merely movement on a historian's map. Every loss has a household. This reality encourages caution even within a culture that values martial achievement. Experienced leaders understand that unnecessary casualties weaken families and reduce the community's future strength. You can almost hear an older warrior advising patience. He does not need grand language. Check the horses, watch the wind, know the water, understand who stands ahead of you before deciding what bravery requires. Practical wisdom accumulates. By the later 18th century, Comanche military power rests upon this combination of individual riding ability and collective experience. Speed allows warriors to exploit information faster than many opponents can respond. Distance protects them. Terrain conceals them. Horse herds sustain them. Family networks give their actions meaning. The physical environment remains unforgiving. However, summer sun can drain strength rapidly, while sudden winter weather transforms exposed plains into dangerous country. A warrior's body feels every mile. His thighs ache after long riding. Dust gathers around his eyes, and fingers stiffen during cold mornings. Heroic reputation does not provide warmer hands. The plains remain indifferent. That indifference helps shape disciplined mobility. When you ride through this country long enough, you stop imagining distance as empty space. Every stream, ridge, grassland, and sheltered hollow carries potential importance. A low hill becomes an observation point. A river becomes both water and barrier. A patch of good grass becomes fuel for the animals carrying your future. This is how geography becomes military knowledge. As evening approaches, the scouting party finally returns toward camp. Their horses are tired but controlled. An orange light stretches across the western horizon. Children notice them first. Someone walks outward to meet a returning relative, studying his expression before asking what he has seen. Information passes quietly through camp as preparations begin for whatever tomorrow requires. The riders have fought nobody, yet their journey may prevent an ambush, locate buffalo, reveal strangers, or guide the entire community towards safer ground. That is power too, and increasingly, the same riding skills that make Comanche warriors dangerous also make their families exceptionally successful hunters. Across the horizon, immense buffalo herds are waiting. Across that horizon, the dark shapes begin gathering until individual animals disappear into something resembling a moving landscape. Buffalo spread across the grass in numbers difficult for modern eyes to imagine, providing the material foundation beneath much of Comanche life. The warrior who masters distance must also master the hunt, because military skill means little if families cannot eat. You approach the herd carefully. Morning sunlight rests low across the prairie, revealing clouds of breath rising from animals nearest the riders. Their heavy bodies move through dry grass while calves remain close beside larger adults. The sound carries surprisingly far. Hooves press against earth. Animals call within the herd, and grass whispers beneath thousands of moving legs. Riders remain outside the mass while experienced hunters study wind and terrain. Nobody wants unnecessary chaos. A buffalo can outrun expectations, turn suddenly, and injure a horse that moves too close. Successful hunting requires courage. Certainly. But courage without control is an efficient method for creating problems. The hunters wait. Behind them, camp depends upon what happens here. Buffalo provide meat, hide, sinew, bone, and other materials used throughout everyday life. Their importance extends into shelter, clothing, equipment, household production, trade, and seasonal movement. Modern historians broadly recognize buffalo hunting as central to Comanche economic power during the 18th and 19th centuries. Research across American universities, including work associated with environmental historians at the University of Oklahoma and the University of Texas, has examined how plains economies developed around buffalo, horses, and regional trade. The relationship is complicated. Comanche people do not simply follow buffalo helplessly wherever herds decide to wander. Human decisions involve security, weather, horse grazing, water, trading opportunities, and relationships with neighboring communities. Historians still debate the precise size and movement of historic buffalo populations during different periods. Estimates vary because 19th century observations were uneven, and later, ecological reconstruction must combine several imperfect forms of evidence. No exact number captures what you see. The important truth is scale. Huge herds can support extensive hunting, but they remain mobile animals inhabiting an environment affected by drought. Severe winters, fire, predators, and changing grass conditions. Comanche hunters learn these rhythms through experience. Your horse begins moving beneath you. The riders accelerate gradually before entering the edge of the herd, choosing animals while maintaining enough space to maneuver. Dust rises immediately and turns the clear morning into a blurred world of movement. Now everything feels close. The smell of horse sweat mixes with dry soil while buffalo thunder across the prairie. Riders must control their mounts while concentrating on animals moving only a short distance away. There is little room for distraction. A hunting horse trained for this work becomes enormously valuable because it responds quickly to pressure and changing direction. Rider and animal operate through habits built during countless hours together. The chase does not last forever. Experienced hunters understand that exhausting valuable horses unnecessarily would make little sense. Once enough animals have been taken, the difficult labor simply changes form. Families begin processing the results. This work requires skill, organization, and considerable physical effort. Meat must be prepared for immediate consumption or preservation, while hides require careful treatment before they become useful. Hands become sore, knives need attention, children carry smaller tasks, and people work while the day continues warming around them. The excitement of the chase gives way to steady concentration. Here, household labor becomes economic power. Women play especially important roles in processing hides and producing goods essential to domestic life and trade. Their expertise transforms raw materials into shelter coverings, clothing, containers, bedding, and marketable products. Older children learn beside them. A girl watches the exact movement of an experienced relative's hands and attempts the same task herself. Her first effort is slower, naturally, because history rarely mentions how often expertise begins with somebody doing something badly. The correction comes gently. She tries again. That intimate moment contains an entire system of knowledge transmission. Skills survive because people teach them within households, often through repeated observation rather than formal instruction. Nearby, strips of meat are prepared. Wood smoke drifts through camp while dogs investigate every possible opportunity for unauthorized participation. Someone moves food farther from their reach, having apparently encountered this ancient problem before. Laughter interrupts the work. The atmosphere relaxes after the dangerous hunt. But the labor continues. A successful buffalo harvest must be protected from spoilage and transported efficiently. Horses again change what's possible. Mounted communities can carry larger quantities of processed meat, hides, tools, and household possessions between seasonal locations. Pack animals increase the material capacity of families living highly mobile lives. This creates a useful cycle. Horses improve buffalo hunting. Buffalo products support households and trade. Trade can provide additional horses and manufactured goods. More horses then expand hunting, movement, and military possibilities. Yet no cycle continues automatically. Horse herds require grazing, and large concentrations of animals can quickly consume nearby grass. Camps therefore cannot remain indefinitely in one location simply because hunting has been successful. The environment sets limits. Water matters especially during dry seasons. A stream appearing dependable in spring can shrink dramatically under summer heat. Experienced families remember which rivers remain reliable and which smaller sources become uncertain. Buffalo need water too. Their movements reflect environmental conditions that humans must constantly interpret. Drought can shift familiar patterns and force communities toward different hunting areas. For a moment, the prairie seems endless. Then you realize how carefully everyone studies it. A patch of distant dust might reveal a herd. Dark clouds may promise rain or dangerous weather, while smoke on the horizon could suggest other people nearby. Nothing is simply scenery. The same environmental awareness used by hunters supports warriors and travelers. Following buffalo teaches routes across the plains, exposes riders to unfamiliar country, and creates encounters with other communities. Some encounters produce trade, others produce tension. Competition over hunting territories can contribute to conflict, especially when several populations depend upon the same resources. Yet boundaries remain more flexible than modern property lines might suggest. Use can overlap. Access can change through alliances, warfare, migration, or seasonal conditions. A region controlled strongly during one decade may become contested during another. Scholars continue debating how best to describe this relationship between territory and mobility. Some interpretations emphasize Comanche military dominance, while others stress negotiated access and shifting zones of influence. The evidence supports both caution and complexity. What becomes increasingly clear is that buffalo wealth strengthens Comanche influence across the southern plains. Abundant food supports communities, while hides and other products enter expanding exchange networks. The hunt therefore connects family life to regional politics. Imagine a carefully prepared hide leaving one Comanche camp. It may travel through several exchanges before reaching people who never meet the family that produced it. In return, manufactured objects can move inward from distant settlements and trading networks. Metal tools become especially useful. Firearms and ammunition also circulate, although availability remains inconsistent and dependence upon outside supplies limits their reliability. Horses themselves remain among the most valuable commodities moving across this world. Economic power and military power begin reinforcing each other. Successful warriors can acquire horses. Successful hunters use horses. Households process buffalo products. Traders exchange surplus goods. Leaders distribute wealth and strengthen relationships. Behind these processes stands an animal population that seems almost permanent when you watch it moving across the plains. It is not permanent. You know something the people around you cannot yet know fully. During the 19th century, commercial hunting, expanding settlement, environmental pressures, and deliberate destruction will contribute to the catastrophic collapse of the great buffalo herds. That future remains distant tonight. For now, the herds still dominate the horizon. You stand near camp as evening coolness returns. The smell of cooked meat hangs beside wood smoke, while processed hides lie nearby after another exhausting day of work. A child falls asleep early. An older person remains beside the fire, repairing something with deliberate movements while conversations soften around neighbouring shelters. Beyond camp, horses graze under a fading sky. The buffalo have provided food, materials, security, and goods that can travel outward through distant networks. Their abundance allows Comanche communities to sustain a mobile society across remarkable distances, but abundance alone does not create regional dominance. Resources become power when they can be exchanged, and beyond the next rivers and grasslands, trading routes are spreading towards Spanish settlements, native communities, and distant markets. The Comanche world is about to become connected more widely than ever before. Those carefully prepared hides and valuable horses now begin travelling through networks stretching far beyond any single camp. A Comanche family does not need to see a distant colonial city for goods from that city to influence daily life. Trade carries objects, information, relationships, and danger across the plains with remarkable efficiency. You notice the change beside a busy meeting place. Horses stand in loose groups while people inspect animals, hides, tools, weapons, and other goods brought across considerable distances. Conversations move carefully because exchange requires trust, but never necessarily complete trust. Everyone watches everyone. A horse is examined closely before any agreement becomes serious. Teeth, legs, breathing, temperament, and visible injuries can reveal whether an impressive animal is actually worth the requested price. Nobody appreciates discovering problems later. The horse economy rewards experienced judgment because animals differ enormously in quality. A dependable hunting mount can be worth far more than an ordinary pack animal. Comanche wealth increasingly depends upon these distinctions. By the 18th century, horses are moving through native exchange networks connecting the southern plains with regions far beyond them. Comanche communities become important suppliers and intermediaries within that expanding system. Mainstream historians have documented this commercial influence extensively. Research associated with universities such as Yale, Oxford, and the University of Oklahoma has helped reinterpret the Southern Plains as an economic borderland shaped by native power. Comanche communities were not isolated from colonial markets, but actively influenced how goods moved through them. That perspective changes the map. Instead of imagining Spanish settlements steadily pushing commerce outward, you see trade flowing in several directions simultaneously. Native communities control important routes, supplies, animals, and information that colonial authorities cannot simply command. The Comanche position becomes particularly advantageous. Their expanding horse herds provide both transportation and valuable commodities. Buffalo products create additional goods for exchange, while raiding can introduce captured livestock and possessions into circulation. Trade and warfare begin overlapping. A horse acquired peacefully from one community may have been stolen from another months earlier. By the time it reaches a distant market, reconstructing its entire history would be nearly impossible. The animal carries no paperwork. That is probably convenient. Yet this fluid economy has serious consequences. Horse theft can provoke retaliation, and retaliation can lead to further raids. Economic competition therefore becomes entangled with personal grief, political relationships, and cycles of revenge. One family's prosperity may represent another family's loss. You feel that tension when unfamiliar riders approach a trading gathering. Hands pause briefly over equipment while people study their arrival. No immediate hostility follows. Still, everyone understands how quickly relationships can change when valuable animals are involved. The atmosphere relaxes only after intentions become clearer. Then bargaining resumes. Trade does not require permanent friendship. Communities with histories of conflict can sometimes exchange goods when circumstances make cooperation useful. Practical interests often coexist with unresolved suspicion. This flexibility becomes one hallmark of Comanche diplomacy. Peace may open access to markets, manufactured goods, and grazing territories. Warfare may become attractive when negotiation fails, or when raiding promises greater rewards. Neither condition remains permanent. Historians still debate how closely economic motives can be separated from political. Cultural and personal motives in particular Comanche conflicts. Surviving records rarely provide complete explanations, and colonial writers sometimes reduced complicated decisions to simple assumptions about raiding. Modern scholarship encourages greater caution. A raid might seek horses. It might answer an earlier attack. It might demonstrate strength, rescue relatives, obtain captives, punish enemies, or combine several motives at once. Human decisions are inconveniently complicated. The same is true of trade. You watch a metal tool pass into someone's hands after an exchange. Its value does not come from novelty alone, but from the practical labor it can save. Manufactured goods enter household routines quickly when useful. Metal knives, containers, firearms, ammunition, cloth, and other items become increasingly available through regional exchange. Their distribution remains uneven, however, and access can change when political relationships deteriorate. Firearms demonstrate this dependency clearly. A gun without ammunition eventually becomes a surprisingly complicated club. Powder, shot, maintenance, and replacement parts connect the weapon to supply networks beyond the plains. Comanche warriors therefore continue using bows alongside firearms. Adaptation works better than dependence. Trade also carries information. A visitor from another region may know where soldiers have moved, whether a settlement has many horses, where buffalo were recently seen, or which communities currently seek peace. Information can be exchanged intentionally. It can also escape through ordinary conversation. An experienced leader listens carefully because a casual remark may reveal more than the speaker intended. In a world without instant communication, travelers themselves become moving channels of intelligence. News can outrun armies. A military expedition leaving a Spanish settlement may be reported through native networks before soldiers reach their intended destination. Comanche mobility makes such intelligence especially useful. Fixed settlements cannot disappear. Mounted communities often can. This imbalance increasingly frustrates colonial officials. Spanish authorities attempt diplomacy partly because military solutions prove expensive and unreliable across the enormous borderlands. Gifts and regulated trade become tools for influencing Comanche relationships. From the Spanish perspective, diplomacy may appear to purchase peace. From the Comanche perspective, peace can provide access to valuable goods without surrendering political independence. Both sides may interpret the same agreement differently. That difference matters. Written treaties can create an illusion of permanent resolution, while relationships on the ground continue depending upon local leaders and changing circumstances. One Comanche group may maintain peaceful trade, another may raid elsewhere. Spanish officials sometimes interpret this as deception because they expect agreements to bind everyone uniformly. Decentralized Comanche politics does not function according to that expectation. The marketplace therefore becomes a political classroom. Each exchange teaches both sides what the other values. Comanche traders learn which animals command high demand and which manufactured goods are worth acquiring. Colonial merchants learn that access to plains markets often requires negotiation rather than simple authority. You can hear the gathering around you. Leather creaks as horses shift their weight. While dust rises beneath boots and hooves, someone examines a blanket, rubbing the material between tired fingers before deciding whether the exchange is acceptable. Nearby, a child watches everything. Perhaps this child will become a skilled trader, hunter, or respected leader. Economic knowledge, like horsemanship, begins through observation long before adulthood. An older relative quietly explains something. The lesson may concern value, patience, or the dangerous enthusiasm of anyone appearing too eager during bargaining. Either way, the child remembers. These intimate lessons support a regional economy. Comanche communities increasingly acquire livestock beyond horses as raids and trade reach settled agricultural regions. Cattle and other animals can be consumed, exchanged, or moved across networks. Captives also become part of this borderland system. This aspect of Comanche history requires careful attention because captivity could involve suffering, forced labor, adoption, exchange, or incorporation into households under widely varying circumstances. The experiences were not uniform. Some captives eventually became integrated members of Comanche communities, while others remained constrained or were traded onward. Surviving evidence often reflects outsiders searching for particular individuals rather than recording the full range of captive experiences. Historians continue debating the scale and social meaning of captivity across different periods. What is certain is that human movement becomes inseparable from the expanding economy of the plains. Trade routes carry more than objects. They carry languages, skills, stories, relationships, diseases, and knowledge between communities that might otherwise remain distant. Disease is the darkest passenger. Epidemics introduced through continental contact networks can travel without armies and devastate communities far from the original point of transmission. Native populations possess limited immunity to several diseases introduced from overseas. Comanche mobility cannot always protect them. This vulnerability will become increasingly important later. For now, commercial expansion strengthens their regional position more visibly than disease weakens it. Horse wealth grows, buffalo products remain abundant, and access to colonial goods increases. Successful leaders can distribute imported items and animals. Generosity strengthens relationships. Relationships support cooperation. Cooperation can produce larger hunting gatherings, trading ventures, diplomatic missions, or military expeditions. The economy feeds politics. You leave the trading place as evening light spreads across the plains. Several newly exchanged horses move with the departing group, still uncertain about their unfamiliar riders. A young man watches one animal closely. Tomorrow he will begin learning whether his apparent bargain was brilliant or merely educational. Behind you, goods continue changing hands. Ahead lies a larger and more dangerous commercial world extending south towards settlements where livestock, manufactured goods, and wealth exist in concentrations impossible to ignore. The distances no longer discourage Comanche riders. They invite them. Trade has shown what lies beyond the horizon, while mobility has provided the means to reach it. Peaceful exchange will remain important, but another method of acquiring wealth is expanding beside it. Soon, riders will travel far beyond familiar hunting grounds. Their journeys will carry Comanche influence deep into the southern borderlands, where distant communities begin learning to fear the sound of approaching horses. The riders who leave those familiar hunting grounds now travel into a wider borderland where distance itself becomes part of their strategy. Some journeys follow trade, diplomacy, or family connections, while others carry raiding parties towards settlements rich in horses and livestock. The southern plains no longer contain the full reach of Comanche activity. You ride beneath a moonless sky. The horses move at a controlled pace, their hooves making soft, irregular sounds against hard ground. Nobody wastes an animal's strength because the destination may still be several demanding days away. Water determines the route, so does grass. A successful expedition requires knowledge of rivers, springs, sheltered resting places, and stretches where horses can recover without attracting unwanted attention. The dramatic moment, if one occurs, may last minutes. Preparation consumes days. That imbalance explains much about Comanche raiding. Popular frontier stories often focus almost entirely on sudden attacks, but historians place those events within larger systems of economics, diplomacy, retaliation, and mobility. Raids could target horses, cattle, supplies, captives, or enemies connected with earlier conflicts. Mainstream scholarship has established that Comanche raiding eventually extended hundreds of miles beyond their Central Plains homeland. Historians associated with major universities, including Yale and the University of Texas, have examined how these expeditions affected the economies and security of northern Mexico and Texas. Their influence becomes especially significant during the 19th century. Yet the foundations develop earlier, as Comanche riders acquire better knowledge of southern routes. Distant livestock populations become accessible sources of wealth. Horses taken during successful expeditions can be driven northward and absorbed into herds or exchanged through established networks. Livestock can become mobile currency. A captured horse strengthens transportation, hunting, military capacity, and social standing at the same time. Few other possessions offer such a useful combination. This creates powerful incentives. Still, historians debate how individual raids should be interpreted because surviving accounts usually come from those who suffered them. Those records describe real fear and loss, but they rarely preserve the intentions or internal discussions of the Comanche parties involved. No clear explanation survives for every expedition. Some raids likely pursued wealth primarily, others involve retaliation. Some may have followed personal ambitions or local disputes that larger political authorities understood only afterward. Several motives could exist within the same group. You feel the uncertainty as the riders stop before dawn. A scout returns quietly after examining country ahead. Men gather close enough to hear him without raising their voices across the open ground. The horses are tired. Their coats are damp with sweat despite the cold morning air. And several riders rub stiff fingers before checking equipment. Nothing feels romantic here. Long-distance raiding requires hunger, fatigue, patience, and the constant possibility that information is wrong. A settlement believed vulnerable may contain armed defenders or unexpected soldiers. A known water source may be dry. Another raiding party may already have passed through the area, leaving everyone more alert than usual. Strategy therefore depends upon adjusting plans rather than obeying them blindly. Comanche political flexibility helps again. A war leader generally depends upon voluntary followers attracted by his reputation and expected judgment. His authority during an expedition can be substantial, but reckless decisions may damage future willingness to follow him. Success builds confidence. Failure has relatives. That simple truth follows every rider south when an expedition approaches settled country. The landscape itself begins changing. Open grasslands increasingly give way to cultivated areas, ranches, roads, scattered buildings, and livestock concentrated near human communities. Such concentration creates opportunity. It also creates danger. Settlers know animals are vulnerable and may organize guards, patrols, or defensive responses. Spanish and later Mexican authorities struggle repeatedly to protect enormous frontier districts with limited manpower. The geographical problem is severe. A government can place soldiers near towns, missions, forts, or major routes, but raiders are not required to attack those exact places. Mounted groups can search for weak points across hundreds of miles. They can bypass defenses. A patrol arriving tomorrow is little comfort when horses disappear tonight. You can imagine the morning after a raid without needing graphic detail. A family steps outside into cold air and finds an enclosure strangely empty. Tracks cross disturbed earth toward the open country. Someone counts what remains. Another person realizes that animals essential for transport and livelihood are gone. Anger arrives quickly, followed by the practical question of whether pursuit is possible. Distance has already begun working for the raiders. Driving captured horses slows movement, however. This creates one of the dangerous moments of the expedition. The party must manage unfamiliar animals while watching for pursuers and preserving enough strength to return home. Dust becomes an enemy. A large herd can reveal movement from considerable distance, especially across open country. Riders may divide animals, alter routes, travel during cooler hours, or use terrain to reduce visibility. The environment shapes every decision. Summer heat drains horses quickly. Cold rain can turn trails into mud. A swollen river may delay movement long enough for pursuers to close distance. Even highly skilled riders remain subject to weather and geography. One evening, rain catches the returning party. Canvas is scarce, shelter imperfect, and damp clothing clings unpleasantly against tired bodies. A small fire offers warmth, but also creates smoke that might betray their location, so they endure the cold. A young rider sits beside his horse, rubbing the animal's neck while listening to rain strike the ground. His excitement about captured wealth has faded into simple exhaustion. Home still lies far away. That intimate fatigue rarely appears in heroic accounts. Yet it helps explain why successful raiders earn respect. They must manage themselves and their horses across journeys where small mistakes accumulate rapidly. Returning safely transforms the mood. Children run toward familiar riders while relatives search faces before counting horses. Relief often comes before celebration because the living have returned. Captured animals then enter social circulation. Some remain with participants. Others may be distributed among relatives or exchanged later. Generosity can enhance the reputation of successful warriors and leaders. Material success becomes social influence. Yet every raid also reshapes relationships beyond camp. Settlements suffering repeated losses demand protection. Military authorities organize punitive expeditions, while local communities may seek alliances or negotiate peace. Trade can be interrupted. Old agreements become fragile. A cycle develops in which retaliation produces new retaliation. Although not every group participates equally, local peace can coexist with violence elsewhere. This creates administrative confusion. Spanish officials, and later Mexican authorities, often want a single agreement capable of stopping all Comanche raiding. Decentralized political organization makes such universal enforcement extremely difficult. A leader can influence his own followers. He cannot necessarily command distant groups with different interests. This distinction becomes increasingly important as raiding expands deeper south. By the 19th century, some Comanche expeditions penetrate far into northern and central areas of Mexico. Communities far from the Central Plains become connected to Comanche power through fear, trade disruption, livestock losses, and defensive spending. Modern scholars sometimes describe this influence in imperial terms. Others caution against using the word empire too literally, because Comanche communities did not construct a centralized territorial state resembling European empires. The debate remains useful. Comanche power often operated through mobility, economic pressure, military reach, and negotiated relationships rather than permanent occupation. They could profoundly influence regions without administering them directly. You can see why from horseback. Controlling every settlement would require remaining there. Remaining there would sacrifice the mobility that creates much of the advantage. Instead, the ability to appear, withdraw, return, negotiate, trade, or raid gives Comanche groups influence across territory far larger than any continuously occupied homeland. Their reputation travels even farther. Rumors of approaching riders can empty isolated ranches before anyone confirms whether a raiding party actually exists. Fear becomes a force capable of moving people without direct violence. That psychological effect matters. Frontier families alter where they live, how they guard livestock, and when they travel. Governments spend resources responding to threats that are difficult to predict. Meanwhile, Comanche communities continue ordinary life farther north. Buffalo are hunted. Children learn riding. Families repair shelters. Traders exchange goods. Warriors return from distant expeditions carrying stories that become part of collective knowledge. One rider remembers a river crossing. Another remembers where soldiers appeared. Someone else remembers a valley containing excellent grazing after rain. Such details may shape an expedition years later. Experience accumulates geographically. The borderlands become mapped through memory. As night settles over the returning camp, horses shift beyond the firelight. Some animals were born far south and have never stood beneath this particular northern sky. Now they are part of Comanche wealth. The journey that brought them here has connected distant settlements to plains families through an economy partly sustained by raiding. But raids cannot explain everything. Comanche power also depends upon knowing when violence costs more than negotiation. Spanish authorities are slowly reaching the same conclusion from the opposite direction. Military campaigns have failed to produce easy control. Trade remains necessary. Diplomacy becomes unavoidable. Across the borderlands, representatives of two very different political worlds are preparing to sit together and discover whether peace can succeed where pursuit has repeatedly failed. The riders returning from those distant expeditions now enter a world where negotiation can become as important as speed. Spanish officials have spent decades discovering an uncomfortable truth across the northern frontier. Comanche power cannot easily be removed by sending another exhausted column of soldiers across enormous stretches of grassland. The problem begins with geography. New Mexico's settlements sit within a landscape of mountains, deserts, river valleys, and plains extending far beyond convenient military control. Soldiers must protect communities while also guarding livestock, roads, supply lines, and distant outposts. Every patrol requires horses. Every horse requires grass and water. Every soldier consumes supplies that must somehow reach him across country, where weather can destroy the best administrative plan. Comanche groups face environmental limits too, but mobility allows them greater freedom to choose where encounters occur. Spanish commanders cannot defend everywhere. You can almost hear the frustration inside a frontier office. Paper maps lie across a wooden table while candle smoke curls toward a dark ceiling. An official studies another report describing missing animals, uncertain alliances, or riders seen somewhere beyond settled country. The ink provides information. It does not provide control. Spanish authorities therefore experiment repeatedly with warfare, diplomacy, trade, gifts, and alliances. Their policies change because conditions change, and because previous solutions rarely remain permanent. The Comanche are changing too. By the middle and later 18th century, their military and economic strength has grown substantially across the southern plains. Their relationships with Spanish New Mexico become increasingly important to both sides. One major historical turning point arrives in the 1780s. In 1786, Spanish authorities in New Mexico reached an important peace arrangement with influential Comanche leaders after years of conflict. The agreement helped create a period of more stable trade and diplomacy between many Comanche groups and Spanish settlements. This is a mainstream historical fact supported by extensive documentary evidence. Scholars of the Spanish borderlands at institutions including Yale, the University of California, and the University of New Mexico have examined these negotiations within broader systems of native diplomacy. Their work emphasizes that Spain was negotiating with powerful indigenous political actors, rather than simply imposing frontier policy. The distinction matters enormously. Peace does not mean Comanche submission. Spanish officials offer trade opportunities, gifts, diplomatic recognition, and access to goods because they need cooperation. Comanche leaders participate because peaceful relations can provide material and strategic advantages. Both sides gain something. Neither side controls everything. Historians continue debating how much individual leaders could commit other Comanche communities to these agreements. Surviving Spanish documents naturally emphasize negotiators visible to colonial authorities, while internal Comanche decision-making remains less fully recorded. So the peace should not be imagined as one signature instantly transforming the plains. Relationships must be maintained. You sense this when a diplomatic gathering begins. People approach cautiously, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of horses, equipment, and conversation. Each side has reasons to appear confident without making the other side feel threatened. That is a delicate performance. A Spanish official may wear clothing intended to communicate authority, even after days of uncomfortable frontier travel. Dust does not care about imperial dignity, unfortunately. Comanche leaders also understand presentation. The number and quality of horses, accompanying relatives, personal bearing, and confidence during negotiation can communicate power before formal discussion begins. Gifts become politically significant. To modern eyes, gift exchange may resemble generosity surrounding a diplomatic meeting in 18th century borderlands. However, gift can represent recognition, obligation, alliance, and continuing relationships. Their meaning is practical. Spanish authorities distribute manufactured goods and other valued items partly to strengthen peaceful ties. Comanche leaders can redistribute goods among relatives and followers, reinforcing their own social relationships. Diplomacy enters household economies. Trade follows. Comanche visitors increasingly bring buffalo products and other goods towards Spanish settlements while acquiring metal tools, cloth, weapons, ammunition, food products, and additional manufactured items. Horses remain central. Spanish communities want animals, while Comanche herds represent enormous wealth and mobility. Commercial exchange can therefore provide benefits that warfare would endanger. Peace has economic weight. For families living near contested frontier districts, the emotional change can be profound. Imagine waking without immediately wondering whether distant riders mean danger. Livestock still needs guarding, naturally, and trust remains imperfect. But daily routines become less tense when agreements hold. Children notice adults relaxing. Markets become busier. Travel becomes somewhat more predictable. And people who once knew one another mainly through conflict begin developing repeated commercial relationships. Human familiarity complicates old categories. A trader may bargain regularly with someone from a community his relatives once fought. Practical cooperation does not erase memory, but it creates new incentives for restraint. The Comanche benefit strategically as well. Peace with New Mexico can provide access to supplies while allowing attention to shift toward other rivals and opportunities. Spanish authorities hope the relationship will stabilize their frontier and redirect Comanche pressure elsewhere. Diplomacy becomes strategy by other means. This does not produce universal harmony. Violence continues in other regions, and individual incidents threaten broader agreements. Horse theft remains especially capable of turning peaceful relationships sour with impressive efficiency. One missing herd can create several angry families. Officials then face the difficult task of determining responsibility. Was the theft committed by people connected to the peace agreement, a distant group outside it, or someone else entirely? The plains rarely provide easy answers. Comanche decentralization makes collective punishment particularly dangerous because attacking the wrong group can transform neutral people into enemies. Spanish officials gradually learn to distinguish among different leaders and communities more carefully. Their records begin revealing increasingly detailed knowledge of Comanche political relationships. The Comanche learn Spanish behavior too. They understand which settlements provide trade, which officials are reliable, and which promises deserve skepticism. Diplomacy becomes a field of accumulated experience just like hunting routes. Knowledge travels between generations. A young person accompanying older relatives to a settlement watches negotiations without controlling them. He notices who receives gifts, who speaks confidently, and when conversations become tense. He also notices unfamiliar smells, cooking fires mix with livestock, crowded rooms, dust, and the faint sharpness of metal tools. Buildings make sound differently from hide shelters when wind presses against them. Everything feels enclosed. For someone accustomed to broad plains, narrow streets and permanent walls may seem strangely fixed. Yet these settlements contain useful goods and concentrated markets. The contrast becomes familiar. Comanche visitors can participate in colonial trade without becoming colonial subjects. That ability reflects the balance of power Spain has been forced to recognize. Military campaigns help to create this recognition. Earlier Spanish efforts against Comanche groups demonstrated how difficult mounted enemies could be to pursue across familiar plains. Even successful operations could not guarantee lasting control. Distance protects independence. Spain possesses forts, towns, bureaucracy, and international imperial resources. Comanche communities possess mobility, horses, environmental knowledge, and the ability to disperse across vast territory. Neither advantage automatically cancels the other. The result is accommodation. Prestigious scholarship on Borderlands history increasingly emphasizes these negotiated spaces where imperial authority weakened with distance. On paper, European empires claimed enormous territories. On horseback, reality looked different. A royal decree written thousands of miles away cannot water a thirsty patrol horse. It cannot locate a mobile camp or persuade buffalo to remain near a convenient military road. Local conditions determine power. The peace established during the later 18th century therefore reflects Comanche strength as much as Spanish diplomacy. Spain adapts because adaptation costs less than endless frontier warfare. Comanche leaders adapt for similar reasons. Trade supplies useful goods. Peace protects commercial relationships. Diplomatic recognition strengthens leaders capable of managing those relationships successfully. Yet there remains an intimate cost beneath all these calculations. People remember relatives lost during earlier fighting. A treaty cannot remove grief. You sit beside a quiet evening fire after traders return from a Spanish settlement. Someone examines a newly acquired metal object while an older relative watches without much interest. Perhaps the elder remembers another time. For him, Spanish settlements may remain associated with danger rather than commerce. Younger people growing up during peaceful years can develop different expectations. History changes inside families this way. One generation remembers enemies, another remembers markets. Both memories can be true. By the closing years of the 18th century, Spanish officials increasingly treat Comanche groups as essential participants in regional politics. Stable relations in New Mexico demonstrate that negotiated coexistence can succeed when both sides perceive benefits, but the larger borderland remains unsettled. Comanche influence continues extending toward Texas and farther south, where conditions differ from those around New Mexico. Livestock wealth creates opportunities that diplomacy cannot always contain. Then another transformation approaches. Spain's empire in North America begins facing pressures far beyond anything happening on the plains. Political upheaval will eventually break the colonial system itself. Comanche families do not need to understand every distant revolution to experience its consequences. Trade networks will shift. Military budgets will weaken. Frontier defenses will become uncertain. The Spanish officials who negotiated peace will eventually give way to representatives of a newly independent Mexico struggling to control an enormous northern frontier. You hear distant bells from a settlement as evening settles across the valley. Beyond those buildings, darkness spreads toward the plains. Comanche riders remain somewhere out there, connected to Spanish society through trade yet politically independent from it. The balance has been negotiated. Soon, the government on the other side of that balance will change completely. The government changes, but the distances do not. When Mexico becomes independent from Spain in 1821, the northern frontier remains immense, thinly defended, and deeply connected to native political worlds that existed long before independence. Comanche riders still know the rivers, grazing grounds, trails, and weaknesses of this country better than most officials assigned to govern it. At first, political change feels distant. A family camped beside a plains river does not awaken one morning because a new flag has replaced an old one hundreds of miles away. Horses still need water, buffalo still move with the seasons, and cold wind still enters every poorly secured opening. Yet institutions matter eventually. Spanish authorities had spent decades developing diplomatic relationships, trading practices, gifts, and frontier arrangements involving Comanche groups. Mexican independence disrupts portions of that system at a moment when the new government faces severe financial and political challenges. Resources become uncertain. Officials responsible for northern settlements must protect enormous territories with limited soldiers, unreliable supplies, and competing local demands. Maintaining regular diplomacy with powerful Comanche communities becomes increasingly difficult. Modern historians identify this weakening frontier system as one important factor behind intensifying conflict during the 19th century. Scholarship associated with institutions including Yale, the University of Texas, and the University of California has examined how Mexican political instability intersected with native power across the borderlands. The story is not simply one of governmental collapse. Local officials continue negotiating. Traders continue exchanging goods. Some Comanche groups maintain peaceful relationships in particular places while others raid elsewhere. The frontier remains fragmented rather than uniformly hostile. That complexity creates serious problems. A Mexican official receiving reports of raids may demand action against the Comanche generally, yet the people responsible could belong to a specific group operating independently from others, maintaining peaceful trade. Punishing everyone risks widening conflict. Doing nothing appears weak. There is rarely a comfortable option. Historians still debate how strongly Mexican policy itself contributed to the escalation of raiding compared with economic opportunities. Demographic pressures, local conflicts, and changing Comanche political interests. The evidence reveals several causes operating together rather than one simple explanation. You feel those pressures gathering slowly. A Comanche party prepares for a southern expedition, while families remain behind near familiar hunting grounds. Equipment is checked carefully because the journey may extend across hundreds of miles. Horse condition matters immediately. One animal has a swollen leg and cannot travel. Another seems healthy but has lost weight after difficult grazing. So an experienced rider chooses a stronger mount. Practical judgment comes before ambition. The party eventually moves south through country, becoming progressively warmer and drier. Grass changes beneath the horses, while water sources become increasingly important. Dust settles into clothing. At midday, sunlight presses against riders and animals until even conversation seems unnecessary. Travel resumes more comfortably when the heat begins fading. These expeditions can penetrate deeply into Mexican territory. By the 1830s and especially the 1840s, large Comanche raids reach far beyond the immediate borderlands. Some parties travel hundreds of miles southward, targeting livestock and settlements across northern Mexico. The geographical scale is extraordinary. Comanche warriors are operating across distances comparable to military campaigns conducted by organized states. Yet they lack permanent supply depots along their routes. Instead, knowledge supports movement. Riders understand where water may be found and where captured livestock can be driven. They learn routes through repeated expeditions and information carried between participants. Memory becomes infrastructure. There are no paved military roads waiting conveniently for them. A river valley, mountain passage, or a reliable spring serves the function that roads and stations provide elsewhere. This knowledge accumulates across years. An older warrior can warn younger riders that one water source becomes unreliable late in summer. Another remembers where defenders pursued a previous party and suggests a different return route. Experience prevents repetition of mistakes. The raids increasingly damage northern Mexican communities. Livestock disappears in large numbers from vulnerable ranching districts. Farms and settlements experience insecurity, while travel between isolated communities becomes dangerous during periods of heightened raiding. Families alter their behavior. People bring animals closer to settlements when rumors spread. Travelers postpone journeys, and local authorities attempt to organize defenses with whatever manpower is available. Fear arrives before riders do. Imagine a ranching family hearing an uncertain report from travelers. Someone claims a large mounted party has been seen several days north. Nobody knows whether the report is accurate, whether the riders are approaching, or whether they have already turned elsewhere. The family must decide anyway. Livestock is gathered. Doors are checked. A teenager watches adults speaking more quietly than usual and understands enough to become frightened. No attack occurs that night. The uncertainty itself becomes exhausting. Comanche communities experience fear and uncertainty too. Because southern expeditions remain dangerous, Mexican defenders organize resistance, and pursuing forces can threaten raiders burdened with captured animals. Some riders never return. Back on the plains, a family waits beyond the expected time. Each distant movement on the horizon attracts attention. Children may run outward before discovering that the approaching riders belong to another group. Waiting stretches painfully. Then one evening, familiar horses appear. Relief spreads through camp before anyone begins counting captured animals. A woman reaches a returning relative and touches his arm as though confirming that distance has truly released him. The emotional transition is immediate. Exhausted riders become sons and husbands again. Captured livestock follows behind them, representing economic success purchased through risk. Some animals may remain within the community, while others enter trading networks stretching toward the United States and other native groups. This commercial connection is important. Raiding does not produce wealth in isolation. Markets make captured livestock more valuable, because animals can circulate beyond the communities that obtained them. The borderland economy therefore connects violence with trade. Mexican horses and livestock can move northward through Comanche networks, eventually reaching buyers who may know almost nothing about their origins. Economic geography expands. The Comanche sphere of activity increasingly connects the plains, Texas, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Some historians use the term Comanche Empire to describe this extraordinary influence. Others remain cautious. There is no centralized imperial government collecting regular taxes from conquered provinces or administering Mexican towns. Comanche influence works differently, through military reach, mobility, trade, diplomacy, and the ability to impose severe costs upon neighboring regions. The scholarly debate is partly about definitions. The power itself is difficult to deny. Mexican authorities struggle to prevent raids because defensive forces remain dispersed across enormous territory. Even when soldiers defeat one party, the broader system continues. Fixed defense has structural weaknesses. A settlement must protect itself every day. A raiding party needs to find weakness only once. That imbalance gives mobile forces an advantage, particularly when local governments lack enough troops to patrol effectively. Environmental conditions worsen the challenge. Drought can reduce grazing and concentrate livestock near reliable water. Heavy rain can make roads nearly useless for military pursuit while mounted raiders choose different routes. Cold can damage horses on both sides. Nature refuses political allegiance. Meanwhile, Mexico faces internal conflicts and international pressures that consume resources needed on the northern frontier. Governments change, military priorities shift, and local communities often feel abandoned. Some regional authorities turn toward controversial policies involving payments or rewards for violence against native peoples. Such measures deepen hostility and contribute to cycles of retaliation. The borderlands become harsher. Peace agreements still occur. Local diplomacy never disappears completely because endless warfare remains expensive for everyone. Traders, officials, and Comanche leaders can all benefit when exchange replaces conflict. But agreements struggle against competing incentives. A leader maintaining peace cannot necessarily stop distant warriors from raiding somewhere else. Mexican authorities cannot always control local militias or guarantee promised goods. Trust becomes fragile. One broken promise can echo for years. You hear that fragility in conversations beside an evening fire. Older people remember periods when Spanish trade arrangements seemed more dependable. Younger warriors know a different frontier. For them, Mexico may appear less as a powerful imperial neighbor and more as a vast landscape containing vulnerable livestock, scattered defenses, dangerous enemies, and profitable opportunities. Generational experience changes expectations. The Comanche warrior world has now expanded far beyond buffalo hunting and local plains competition. Riders can leave camps near the central grasslands and return from journeys reaching deep into another nation. Their reputation grows accordingly. Mexican settlements increasingly understand Comanche power through absence as much as presence. Empty corrals, Abandoned ranches, delayed travel, and defensive preparations reveal influence even when no warriors are visible. Yet another political transformation is occurring farther east. American settlers have entered Texas in growing numbers. Texas is broken from Mexico. New towns, farms, roads, and livestock herds are spreading toward regions Comanche communities already use and defend. This time the pressure is different. The newcomers do not merely seek trade or temporary military influence. Many intend to remain permanently upon the land. You look north again as the evening wind cools. The plains remain broad enough to suggest that nothing could ever crowd them. History is about to prove otherwise. The newcomers remain, and that simple fact begins changing the balance more profoundly than another distant change of government. Settlers entering Texas build farms, towns, roads, ranches, and political institutions meant to endure. Their expanding communities increasingly overlap with lands Comanche people already hunt, travel through, trade across, and consider essential to their security. At first, the frontier remains uneven. A settlement may stand beside a river while enormous stretches of lightly occupied country continue beyond it. Roads are muddy after rain, transportation is slow, and communication between distant communities can take days. Permanent settlement nevertheless accumulates. A cabin becomes several cabins. A trading place becomes a town. Fences appear around fields, livestock spreads across nearby grass, and wagon tracks gradually become familiar routes through country previously navigated differently. You can feel the landscape becoming crowded without ever seeing a true crowd. For Comanche families, these changes are not abstract population statistics. A new settlement can affect grazing, hunting access, water, trade, security, and the movement of buffalo. Every building has geography around it. Texas independence from Mexico in 1836 adds another political authority to an already complicated borderland. The new Republic of Texas inherits conflicts that cannot be solved simply by declaring sovereignty over territory. Comanche communities remain powerful. They do not automatically recognize claims written by governments whose settlers cannot physically control much of the land they describe as theirs. This creates fundamentally different understandings of territory. Mainstream historians have long identified this collision between settler expansion and native land use as central to 19th century Texas history. Research at institutions including the University of Texas, Yale, and Stanford has emphasized that the frontier was a contested political landscape rather than an empty boundary moving naturally westward. Maps can hide that contest. A government may draw a line. A family living beyond that line may never have agreed to anything. Historians still debate the relative importance of land hunger. Diplomacy, trade, local retaliation, and governmental policy in producing particular conflicts. Surviving accounts also disagree over responsibility for many violent incidents. The larger trajectory is clearer. Settlement expands. Comanche resistance continues. The space available for avoiding one another gradually contracts. You experience the tension near a Texas settlement during a damp morning. Wagon wheels have cut deep channels into the road, and horses pull reluctantly through mud. Wet leather hangs heavily from equipment. A farmer watches the western horizon while repairing a fence damaged by livestock. His children carry water nearby, accustomed to adults discussing rumors they only partly understand. To them, the frontier is simply home. Farther west, a Comanche family can feel exactly the same way. That symmetry does not remove conflict. Both communities can possess genuine emotional attachments to landscapes whose political futures are incompatible. One society depends heavily upon mobility across broad territory, while the other increasingly transforms land into permanent farms and settlements. Movement meets enclosure. The consequences become violent. Raids and counterattacks occur repeatedly across Texas. Comanche warriors seek horses, livestock, captives, revenge, or strategic pressure, while Texans organize militias, ranger companies, and military expeditions. Each side develops stories about the other. Fear simplifies complicated people into dangerous categories. A settler hearing about a distant raid may begin viewing every Comanche rider as an immediate threat. A Comanche family remembering relatives killed by Texans may see approaching settlers as part of the same expanding danger. Retaliation becomes easier to justify. Peace becomes harder to sustain. Still, diplomacy never disappears. Representatives meet, exchange promises, negotiate captives, discuss boundaries, and attempt temporary agreements. Traders often encourage peace because commerce works poorly when customers are shooting at one another. Yet negotiations face the familiar political problem. Texas officials often expect individual Comanche leaders to speak for a unified nation. Comanche political organization remains decentralized, and leaders cannot necessarily enforce agreements upon every independent group. Misunderstanding becomes structural. One treaty may appear comprehensive on paper while remaining limited in practice. This tension contributes to the tragic Council House confrontation in San Antonio in 1840. Comanche representatives entered negotiations concerning captives, and the meeting deteriorated disastrously into violence. Many Comanche delegates were killed or captured. The event becomes a major turning point in relations between Comanche groups and the Republic of Texas. Trust, already fragile, suffers severely. The response follows quickly. Later that year, a large Comanche force conducts what becomes known historically as the Great Raid of 1840. Riders move through settled areas toward the Texas coast, attacking communities and taking livestock and goods. The scale shocks Texans. Comanche warriors demonstrate again that distance offers little protection when mounted forces can travel rapidly across broad country. Texas forces eventually confront the returning raiders. The campaign reveals both Comanche reach and the growing ability of Texans to organize mounted pursuit. Neither side can assume that older advantages will remain unchanged forever. Technology is shifting too. Firearms improve. Texas Rangers increasingly adopt repeating weapons during the 1840s, changing the tactical relationship between mounted Comanche fighters and opponents who previously struggled with slow reloading. The change should not be exaggerated. A weapon does not erase experience. Terrain, horse quality, leadership, or numerical advantage, yet greater firepower reduces some advantages Comanche warriors had exploited effectively against single-shot firearms. The arms race becomes more dangerous. You hear the mechanical click of cold metal being checked before a patrol departs. A ranger adjusts his saddle while another man complains quietly about the weather. Across the plains, Comanche riders prepare with equal care. Both groups depend upon horses. Both study tracks. Both learn to travel lightly and respond quickly, in uncomfortable ways. Frontier enemies begin learning from each other. Texas Rangers adopt forms of mobile warfare suited to the same environment that shape Comanche tactics. Small mounted units become valuable for scouting, pursuit, and rapid response. The plains are teaching everyone, but permanent settlement gives Texans a different strategic objective. Comanche warriors can win encounters without stopping population growth. Each new farm, road, and town adds another permanent claim upon the landscape. This creates relentless pressure. A raided settlement can be rebuilt. A family may leave, but another may arrive. Population becomes strategic weight. After the United States annexes Texas in 1845, that weight increases dramatically. The Comanche frontier is no longer dealing only with the young republic possessing limited resources. A continental nation now stands behind expansion. The Mexican-American War further transforms the region after 1846. American forces move through the southwest, and the political map changes again following Mexico's defeat. Comanche riders continue crossing those boundaries. To them, a treaty signed between distant governments does not suddenly transform familiar rivers or hunting grounds. Yet the military institutions behind those boundaries become increasingly important. United States forts begin appearing. Soldiers patrol routes. Surveyors, migrants, merchants, and mail services expand through Western territories. Each movement adds another thread to a tightening network. Still, Comanche power remains formidable. American military officers quickly discover the same logistical frustrations that troubled Spanish and Mexican predecessors. Mobile communities cannot easily be forced into decisive battles. A column can ride for weeks and find little. Campfires may already be cold when soldiers arrive. Tracks can divide across hard ground. Water limits pursuit. A cavalry horse exhausted by poor grazing becomes merely a large hungry problem. Comanche warriors understand these limitations intimately. They can avoid strong forces while striking weaker targets elsewhere. Raids continue into Texas and Mexico even as American military presence expands. Yet the emotional atmosphere is changing. Older warriors remember a time when the plains offered more room for withdrawal. Younger riders increasingly encounter roads, farms, military posts, and travelers in places once considered distant. Buffalo patterns are changing too. Commercial pressures remain modest compared with the catastrophe coming later. But growing migration and hunting already disturb parts of the wider ecosystem. A Comanche hunter notices changes locally before any historian measures them. Perhaps buffalo are harder to locate along one familiar route. Perhaps travelers have increased near a water source. Perhaps grass around another campsite has been heavily used by livestock. Small inconveniences accumulate. One evening, a family camps beside a stream remembered from earlier years. The water still runs, but wagon tracks cut across nearby ground. A child places a hand inside one deep rut. The mark is ordinary. To an older relative, it represents something less comfortable. Someone else has begun traveling this route repeatedly. The family eats beside a small fire while horse breath appears in cooling air. Conversation turns toward where they should move next. Nobody announces that an era is ending. History rarely provides that courtesy. Instead, choices become slightly narrower. Routes become slightly busier. Hunting requires slightly greater distance. Military encounters become slightly more dangerous. The Comanche remain capable of projecting power across enormous territory, and their warriors still inspire fear throughout the frontier. Their horse herds, trade networks, environmental knowledge, and political flexibility remain extraordinary strengths. In fact, during these middle decades of the 19th century, their influence can still appear overwhelming. From the Central Plains, riders reach Mexico, Texas, New Mexico, and distant trading networks. Settlements calculate their safety according to Comanche movements. Governments negotiate with them. Armies pursue them. Merchants seek their horses. For a moment, despite growing pressure, Comanche power seems to stand near its greatest geographical reach. You watch riders disappear into sunset beyond the stream. Their silhouettes become smaller until grass and distance absorb them completely. Ahead lies the height of their influence, and hidden inside that height are the forces that will eventually bring the entire mounted world under unbearable pressure. At this height of influence, the plains seem to answer to movement rather than boundaries. Comanche riders can travel from central hunting grounds toward Texas, New Mexico, Kansas, Colorado, and deep into Mexico. Their political authority is decentralized, yet their combined military and economic reach shapes decisions across an extraordinary region. You stand on a rise beneath clear morning light. Grass stretches outward until distant land merges with the sky, broken only by wandering buffalo and small clusters of trees near water, somewhere beyond sight. Several Comanche communities are moving independently through this enormous country. No capital connects them. No permanent palace stands at the center. Yet merchants, soldiers, settlers, Mexican ranchers, and neighboring native peoples all make calculations based upon what Comanche groups might do next. That is influence in practical form. During the first half of the 19th century, historians generally identify the Comanche as the dominant native military and economic power across much of the southern plains. Their strength rests upon horses, buffalo hunting, trade, diplomacy, raiding, environmental knowledge, and flexible political organization. Modern scholarship has examined this power from several directions. Historians working within traditions represented at Yale, Oxford, the University of Texas, and the University of Oklahoma have challenged older narratives that treated Western expansion as a simple movement of European authority. Instead, the Comanche appear as powerful historical actors shaping the borderlands themselves. Some scholars describe the resulting system as an empire. Others prefer terms emphasizing regional dominance or networks of influence because Comanche political organization lacks the centralized bureaucracy associated with many conventional empires. The debate remains open. What matters for you tonight is not the label but the reality experienced by people living nearby. Governments negotiate because Comanche power cannot be ignored. Settlers fear raids. Traders seek access. Other native communities form alliances, compete, exchange goods, or fight according to changing circumstances. Comanche decisions influence markets hundreds of miles apart. You see that influence most clearly through horses. Large herds move near camp, filling the morning with restless sound. Some animals carry riders, while others serve hunting, transport, breeding, exchange, or future gifts. Horse wealth has become enormous. A prosperous household can possess animals whose combined practical value touches almost every aspect of life. Horses move shelters, carry possessions, pursue buffalo, transport traders, and give warriors extraordinary range. But wealth requires labor. Young people watch animals while adults perform other tasks. Herds must be moved toward water and good grazing, protected from theft, and kept away from dangerous terrain. One injured animal demands attention. A boy notices blood along a horse's lower leg after it catches itself against rough ground. An older relative kneels beside him and examines the wound carefully. The moment is quiet. The horse may never appear in any historical document. Yet caring for animals like this sustains the entire mounted economy. Comanche prosperity also depends upon buffalo. Large hunting grounds continue providing food and materials, while processed hides enter regional trade. Families coordinate seasonal movements around ecological conditions rather than remaining permanently concentrated. This dispersal can become strategic. An enemy searching for one decisive Comanche center will not find it, because power is distributed among mobile communities. Destroying one camp cannot automatically control distant groups. Decentralization provides resilience. It can also complicate collective action. Different groups may pursue different diplomatic relationships or military objectives. One community might benefit from peace with a neighboring settlement, while another sees greater advantage in raiding. There is no single switch controlling everyone. American and Mexican officials find this endlessly frustrating. They frequently seek leaders capable of guaranteeing broad peace, only to discover that influence has limits. A respected leader can persuade followers, but may not command unrelated warriors hundreds of miles away. This is not political weakness alone. It is a different political structure. The system functions particularly well, while abundant territory allows communities to remain mobile. Local groups can respond to buffalo movement, drought, enemies, or trading opportunities without waiting for centralized direction. The plains reward flexibility. A storm reminds you how quickly conditions change. Clouds rise darkly during afternoon heat, and wind begins pressing waves through tall grass. Families secure possessions while riders move horses towards safer ground. Then rain arrives. It strikes shelters hard and turns dusty soil into dark mud within minutes. Thunder rolls across open country without buildings to soften its sound. Inside one shelter, a child watches water gather near the entrance. Someone shifts bedding away from the damp edge, and conversation continues as though storms are merely inconvenient visitors. By evening, the clouds have passed. The air smells of wet earth. Such environmental familiarity supports Comanche power as surely as weapons do. Riders know how seasons alter rivers, grass, animal movements, and travel conditions. American soldiers entering unfamiliar plains must learn these realities painfully. Military maps may identify rivers, but they do not always explain whether water is drinkable during a particular season. Supply wagons require passable ground, while cavalry horses need reliable forage. Comanche forces travel differently. War parties can move with fewer logistical burdens, although they still face hunger, thirst, exhaustion, and dangerous weather. Their experience allows them to judge those risks more effectively. Mobility remains their shield. It also remains their sword. Raids can reach distant settlements before defenders receive reliable warning. Afterward, raiders can separate, change direction, or retreat toward familiar country. Mexican frontier districts remain especially vulnerable. During the 1840s and 1850s, northern Mexico experiences severe pressure from Comanche and other native raids. Livestock losses weaken ranching communities, while insecurity affects settlement and transportation. The Comanche economy benefits from captured animals. Some livestock is consumed, some enters herds, some moves through trade networks toward markets elsewhere. The distinction between raiding and commerce becomes blurred again. A horse taken in Mexico may eventually be exchanged far to the north. Each transaction separates the final buyer further from the original act of capture. Trade transforms geography. American merchants increasingly participate in this wider plains economy. Directly or indirectly, manufactured goods flow inward while horses, hides, and livestock move outward. Comanche consumers make choices. They value useful tools and weapons, but do not simply abandon older technologies because something manufactured has appeared. Bows remain effective, while firearms become increasingly important when ammunition and maintenance permit. Practicality decides. The same approach shapes diplomacy. Comanche leaders can negotiate with Americans while maintaining relationships with Mexican traders or other native communities. Political boundaries created by governments do not neatly contain their economic world. Their homeland functions as a crossroads. This helps explain why some modern historians view Comanche power as something greater than military dominance. They influence the circulation of goods and animals across regions belonging nominally to several governments. Power moves through markets. It also moves through reputation. A settlement may change plans because people believe Comanche riders are nearby. Travelers may wait for armed escorts, while ranchers gather livestock closer to defended areas. No attack is required. The possibility is enough. Yet reputation can become misleading. Not every Comanche man is constantly engaged in warfare. Most days involve hunting, animals, family obligations, trade, repair work, travel, and the countless practical tasks required by mobile life. You return to camp during sunset. Someone repairs riding equipment while another person prepares food. Children practice skills that have little dramatic value tonight but may become essential years later. An elder speaks softly nearby. He remembers routes younger riders know only from stories. His knowledge gives shape to a landscape that otherwise appears almost featureless. Memory remains another form of power. But now memory begins competing with change. The United States is expanding rapidly westward after the Mexican-American War. Migration increases across plains routes. Military posts multiply, and commercial networks become more intrusive. Settlers continue pushing into Texas. American officials increasingly demand that Comanche communities restrict their movements to defined areas. Such demands conflict directly with a way of life requiring access to broad hunting territories and seasonal resources. Pressure gathers from several directions. Even more dangerous forces remain invisible. Disease repeatedly strikes native communities during the 19th century. Smallpox and other epidemics can move through trade and travel networks with devastating consequences. Historians debate exact mortality figures for particular Comanche epidemics because records are incomplete. There is little disagreement, however, that introduced diseases severely reduce populations across many native societies. A warrior cannot outride infection easily. Horse skill offers little protection. The same networks bringing valuable goods can carry disease from settlement to settlement and camp to camp. That contradiction sits quietly beneath prosperity. Then buffalo face growing pressure. Commercial hide hunting has not yet reached its most destructive scale. But American market expansion is steadily transforming relationships with plains wildlife. More hunters enter, more roads appear, more travelers disturb established patterns. The world supporting Comanche dominance remains powerful, yet it is becoming vulnerable in ways military success cannot solve. You sense this contradiction beside the evening fire. Horses graze nearby in impressive numbers. Buffalo still exist across enormous spaces, and warriors continue returning from journeys that demonstrate remarkable geographical reach. Nothing looks defeated. That makes what follows more unsettling. Great powers rarely recognize their turning points while standing upon them. The structures producing success can remain visible even as the conditions supporting those structures begin weakening underneath. Comanche society still possesses mobility. It still possesses military skill. It still possesses deep environmental knowledge and extensive trade relationships. But population loss, American expansion, ecological disruption, and increasingly sustained military pressure are beginning to converge. The plains themselves are changing. Tomorrow's riders will inherit every skill developed by the generations before them. They will ride exceptionally well, understand the landscape, and defend their independence with determination. Yet skill cannot restore people lost to epidemics. It cannot create buffalo where herds disappear. And it cannot indefinitely keep millions of newcomers beyond the horizon. The height of Comanche power has been reached. Now the balance begins to turn. The balance turns slowly enough that daily life continues beneath it. Horses still need tending each morning. Buffalo still appear across portions of the plains, and riders still return from distant journeys carrying news. Yet several pressures are now gathering at once, and none can be solved simply by riding faster. Disease has already delivered some of the deepest wounds. Epidemics move through North America along the same networks carrying traders, travelers, manufactured goods, and information. Smallpox becomes especially destructive because native populations lack generations of acquired resistance to the introduced disease. Comanche communities suffer repeated outbreaks. Historical records indicate severe smallpox epidemics affecting the plains during the late 18th and 19th centuries. Exact Comanche population losses remain difficult to calculate, but historians broadly agree that disease caused major demographic damage. Research associated with universities such as Princeton, Yale, and the University of California has helped place epidemics at the center of Native American demographic history. Disease is no longer treated as background scenery surrounding military events. It changes what communities can do. You feel that truth through absence. A camp recovering from epidemic illness sounds different from the lively gatherings you encountered earlier. Work remains unfinished because hands that normally perform it are weak or missing. Children search for familiar adults. An older person sits beside a shelter in exhausted silence, staring toward horses that still require attention regardless of grief. There is no strategic maneuver against this enemy. The emotional transition is brutal because communities accustomed to controlling distance suddenly confront something carried invisibly between people. Mobility can even accelerate exposure when travelers connect distant camps. Historians still debate the exact demographic scale of individual outbreaks. Written estimates often come from outsiders who visited communities irregularly, while population counts were incomplete and sometimes politically motivated. No precise table can reconstruct every family lost. The broader consequence is unmistakable. Fewer people mean fewer hunters, defenders, traders, caregivers, craftspeople, elders, and children who will become the next generation. Recovery takes time. That time is increasingly unavailable. American settlement continues advancing through Texas, while migrants cross the wider plains toward western destinations. Military forts appear along routes that previously carried far less permanent traffic. Roads deepen beneath wagon wheels. Livestock consumes grass near heavily traveled corridors, while hunters and settlers place increasing pressure upon wildlife. Comanche communities can move away from one intrusion. Another appears elsewhere. The old strategy of using distance as protection becomes harder when outsiders occupy more of that distance permanently. You ride along a familiar river and notice fresh wagon tracks near the bank. The marks disappear after several miles, but another trail intersects farther ahead. Wood has been cut near a campsite where trees once provided dependable shelter. Nothing dramatic has happened. That is precisely why the change feels so powerful. Settlement transforms landscapes through accumulation. One cabin rarely destroys a mobile economy. Thousands of cabins, ranches, roads, forts, farms, and livestock herds eventually can. American policy also becomes more restrictive. Officials increasingly seek to confine native peoples within defined areas, replacing broad patterns of seasonal movement with boundaries designed for administrative convenience and settler expansion. For Comanche families, confinement threatens the foundation of economic life. Buffalo do not remain politely within government boundaries. Horse herds require grazing. Hunting requires movement across extensive territory, especially when environmental conditions vary from year to year. A line on paper cannot produce rain. American officials nevertheless continue drawing lines. Treaties and negotiations attempt to establish areas where Comanche groups are expected to remain. Different leaders respond differently, and agreements rarely eliminate conflict. Some seek accommodation, others resist restrictions that appear incompatible with independence and survival. Many probably move between those positions as circumstances change. That human flexibility matters. Historical narratives sometimes divide people neatly into peaceful leaders and militant warriors, but individuals can support negotiation at one moment and resistance at another. A father may prefer peace because his children need security. The same man may fight if he believes that peace now requires surrendering the resources keeping those children alive. Motives change with circumstances. The United States military also changes its methods. Soldiers gain experience operating across plains environments, while improved maps, scouts, mounted units, and logistical networks reduce some earlier disadvantages. The army still struggles. Weather remains merciless, water remains uncertain, and Comanche riders remain capable of avoiding large columns. Yet military pressure can now be maintained more persistently than Spanish or Mexican governments often managed. Permanent forts support repeated campaigns. Supplies can move through expanding transportation systems. Communication improves. The opponent facing Comanche resistance is becoming harder to exhaust. Technology contributes as well. Repeating firearms increase the volume of fire available to soldiers, settlers, and mounted units, again. Technology alone does not decide the struggle. A badly led force remains badly led. An exhausted horse remains exhausted. But accumulated technological advantages matter when combined with population growth, economic resources, and sustained military organization. Comanche warriors adapt wherever possible. They acquire modern firearms through trade and continue exploiting their superior familiarity with local terrain. Raiding remains effective enough to keep large frontier regions insecure, yet replacing ammunition requires access to trade. Replacing population losses is harder. Replacing buffalo will eventually become impossible. For now, the herds remain significant, but commercial demand for buffalo products is increasing. Railroads and expanding markets will soon allow hide hunters to operate at a scale earlier generations could scarcely imagine. The ecological foundation begins trembling. Your mind drifts toward a winter hunt. Dirty snow gathers in shallow depressions while frozen grass breaks beneath horse hooves. Riders scan the horizon for the dark movement that once seemed almost guaranteed. Nothing appears. They continue farther. Cold wind reaches through clothing, and fingers become painfully stiff around equipment. The horses lower their heads against the weather. Eventually buffalo are found. Relief spreads through the hunters. But an older rider remembers when locating them required less effort in this region. One difficult hunt proves nothing. Repeated difficult hunts become a pattern. Environmental historians have emphasized that buffalo decline did not result from one single cause everywhere at the same moment. Climate, native hunting, settler expansion, commercial demand. habitat pressures, and later industrial-scale slaughter interacted in complicated ways. The scholarly debate concerns proportions and timing. The catastrophic 19th century destruction itself is beyond dispute. Comanche people understand the consequences through hunger and distance rather than statistics. When buffalo become scarce, families must travel farther or rely increasingly upon alternative food and trade. Horse herds become harder to maintain during disruption. Trade relationships grow more important precisely when political independence is under greater pressure. Every system begins touching another. Military campaigns interfere with hunting. Reduced hunting weakens food security. Food insecurity can encourage raiding. Raiding produces demands for military retaliation. Retaliation disrupts hunting again. A dangerous cycle forms. American settlers often interpret continued raids primarily as criminal violence. Comanche participants may understand the same actions through survival, retaliation, wealth, political resistance, or older expectations surrounding horse acquisition. Neither perspective prevents suffering. Frontier families remain vulnerable. Comanche families remain vulnerable. Violence spreads through communities where most people spend far more time working than fighting. One evening, a Comanche woman repairs worn material beside a fire while listening to distant conversation about soldiers. Her hands continue moving because equipment will still be needed tomorrow. A child sleeps nearby. The mother glances toward him whenever voices become louder. Politics has entered the household without asking permission. The warriors feel it too. A young rider now inherits a different strategic world from his grandfather. The older man learned that vast distance could usually provide another route, another hunting area, another refuge beyond immediate pressure. The younger man sees forts. He sees settlements. He sees buffalo hunters, wagon routes, and soldiers appearing across country once protected by remoteness. His horsemanship may equal anything from earlier generations. The world beneath the horse has changed. By the 1860s, the American Civil War briefly redirects federal military attention elsewhere. Frontier defenses become uneven, and Comanche raiding increases in some regions. For a moment, older patterns appear capable of returning. They cannot. After the war, the United States possesses renewed military capacity and growing determination to secure Western settlement. Railroads continue expanding. Commercial hunters move deeper onto the plains. Military officers increasingly understand that defeating mounted resistance requires attacking the resources sustaining it, not merely chasing warriors. This realization carries terrible consequences. The coming campaigns will target camps, horse herds, food stores, and the wider economic foundation of independent plains life. At the same time, buffalo destruction accelerates dramatically. You listen to horse breath in the darkness outside camp. Everything familiar is still present. Family, firelight, leather, grass, the quiet movement of animals beyond the shelters. Yet each familiar element is becoming harder to protect. The struggle ahead will not simply ask whether Comanche warriors can defeat soldiers in individual encounters. It will ask whether an entire mobile society can survive when its ecological and economic foundations are systematically compressed. The answer has not been decided. Resistance continues, but the plains that once multiplied Comanche strength are beginning to offer fewer places where that strength can remain independent. The pressure that once gathered along distant horizons now enters the center of Comanche life. By the early 1870s, the struggle is no longer simply about defending territory from another fort or settlement. The buffalo economy itself is collapsing, while American military campaigns increasingly target the material foundations that allow independent communities to remain mobile. You ride across country that feels strangely empty. The grass remains. The sky remains enormous. Wind still travels across the plains without encountering much resistance. Yet the familiar dark masses of buffalo have become harder to find. Days can pass between sightings. For families whose food, shelter materials, trade, movement, and seasonal routines depend heavily upon buffalo, scarcity creates problems that cannot be solved by courage. The transformation accelerates during the 1870s. Commercial hide hunters enter the southern plains in growing numbers, supported by expanding markets and transportation networks. Large quantities of buffalo are killed for hides, while carcasses are often left across the landscape. The scale becomes catastrophic. Mainstream historical scholarship identifies this commercial slaughter as a major force behind the rapid destruction of the southern plains buffalo herds. Researchers associated with institutions including the University of Kansas, Yale, and the University of California have examined the connections between markets, railroads, hunting, military expansion, and ecological collapse. There is scholarly debate about government responsibility. Historians continue discussing how directly federal authorities intentionally encouraged buffalo destruction as a strategy against plains peoples. Individual military officers clearly understood that removing buffalo would weaken native resistance. While commercial hunters were primarily responding to market incentives, the exact relationship remains debated. The outcome does not. Buffalo disappear at astonishing speed. You can imagine what that means without seeing a single battlefield. A hunting party reaches a familiar area and finds scattered remains instead of a living herd. Wind moves through dry grass around bones exposed beneath the sun. Nobody speaks for several moments. An older hunter studies the distance as though patience might restore what memory tells him should be there. It does not. The riders continue. Horses need grass and water regardless of disappointment. While people waiting in camp still require food, hunger changes decisions. Comanche groups can trade for supplies, raid settlements, hunt remaining wildlife, or accept provisions offered through government agencies. Each option carries political consequences. Dependence threatens independence. Government officials understand this. Reservations are increasingly presented as the place where food and supplies will be available. But accepting reservation life means surrendering much of the mobility that sustained Comanche society. Some families accept, others refuse. Many move between reservation settlements and the open plains according to changing circumstances, family relationships, hunger, and political pressure. There is no single Comanche response. That distinction matters as much now as it did during earlier diplomacy. Some leaders conclude that continued resistance has become too costly. Others believe surrender will destroy the independence generations fought to preserve. Neither decision is emotionally simple. You sit beside a small fire while cold soup cools inside a metal container. Supplies are limited, and conversation turns toward relatives already living near government agencies. Someone says they are receiving food. Another person questions whether promised supplies arrive reliably. A third remains silent. His horse stands nearby, thinner than it would have been during years of abundant hunting. He runs a hand along the animal's neck before returning to the fire. The decision is becoming physical. It is measured in hunger. The United States military now intensifies pressure. After the Civil War, army officers develop increasingly aggressive strategies against native groups resisting confinement. Rather than waiting for large battles, columns seek camps, supplies, and horse herds. Winter campaigning becomes especially important. Cold weather once offered some protection because military operations were difficult during winter. Soldiers increasingly attempt to exploit that season instead, attacking communities when mobility and resources are strained. The approach can be devastating. Destroying shelters, food stores, and horses weakens entire communities even when relatively few warriors are directly engaged. Military power shifts from battlefield confrontation toward economic destruction. The Comanche warrior therefore faces an impossible strategic problem. He can avoid soldiers, but he cannot carry an entire buffalo ecosystem away from commercial hunters. He can replace a lost weapon. Replacing hundreds of captured horses is harder. He can move his family. Finding untouched country becomes increasingly difficult. Still, resistance continues. The Red River War of 1874 and 1875 becomes the decisive military campaign against Comanche. Kiowa, Southern Cheyenne, and Arapaho groups resisting reservation confinement across the southern plains. Several events help ignite the conflict. In June 1874, native warriors attack buffalo hunters at adobe walls in the Texas Panhandle. The hunters defend their positions successfully, demonstrating how firearms and fortified shelter can reduce the advantages of mounted attackers. The engagement becomes famous. Its larger importance lies in what follows. The United States Army launches coordinated campaigns designed to keep resistant groups under continuous pressure. Columns move through the Texas Panhandle and surrounding plains, searching for camps and supplies. The soldiers experience miserable conditions. Heat, dust, difficult water, and long marches punish men and animals. Later, cold weather creates different problems. Comanche fighters remain elusive. They know the country better and can often avoid direct confrontation. Yet avoidance no longer guarantees strategic success because the army is targeting resources. One devastating episode occurs at Palo Duro Canyon in September 1874. American forces surprise native camps within the canyon. Many inhabitants escape, but soldiers capture a huge number of horses and destroy substantial stores and property. The captured horses create a logistical problem. The army cannot conveniently keep them all. Most are killed to prevent their recovery. For Comanche and allied families, the loss is catastrophic. A horse is transportation. A horse is hunting capacity. A horse is wealth. A horse can represent years of breeding, training, exchange, and accumulated family labor. Now hundreds disappear at once. Imagine returning cautiously after soldiers leave. Smoke lingers around damaged possessions while familiar animals are gone. Someone searches through what remains, looking for anything still useful. A child recognizes part of a household object. An adult takes it from his hands and quietly places it among the few things worth carrying. There is no triumphant music, only work. Survival immediately demands movement. Yet movement has become harder because the animals needed for transportation have been lost. That contradiction breaks resistance more effectively than many battlefield victories. Military records document these campaigns extensively, but numbers alone cannot convey the human experience. Every destroyed supply represents future meals, clothing, shelter, or trade. Every captured horse changes tomorrow's distance. The army continues its pursuit through late 1874 and into 1875. Small groups surrender. Others remain away longer. Food becomes increasingly scarce as buffalo disappear, and military pressure prevents normal seasonal activity. Exhaustion spreads. The emotional transition is different from sudden defeat. There is no single moment when everyone realizes resistance has ended. Instead, possibilities close one after another. A hunting ground fails. A horse herd disappears. A trading relationship becomes unreliable. Another relative moves onto the reservation. Another winter approaches. Eventually, the remaining choices become painfully narrow. Historians sometimes debate whether the final collapse of armed resistance should be credited primarily to military campaigning or buffalo destruction. Separating them too sharply can be misleading. The forces reinforce one another. Without buffalo, independent communities become economically vulnerable. Without horses and supplies, reaching remaining buffalo becomes harder. Military campaigns prevent recovery while commercial hunting continues destroying the resource base. Settlement then occupies the spaces opened by both processes. The system closes like a tightening circle. Yet Comanche warriors continue demonstrating remarkable skill within those conditions. They evade columns, move families through difficult terrain, gather information, and maintain resistance despite severe material disadvantages. Their struggle is no longer symmetrical. The United States can replace soldiers, ammunition, horses, and supplies through an industrial economy extending far beyond the plains. Comanche communities cannot replace vanished buffalo herds through any comparable system. Scale becomes decisive. You watch one final winter evening settle across the grass. Dirty snow remains beneath sheltered ridges, while wind cuts through clothing and makes exposed fingers ache. A small group of riders approaches camp. Their horses walk slowly. Nobody rushes to ask about victory because the important question has become whether they found food. They found little. Families gather around the news. An older warrior looks toward the western horizon, where buffalo once moved in numbers large enough to darken entire stretches of country. His memories belong to another world. The young people beside him know that world mostly through stories. That difference marks the end more clearly than any treaty. By early 1875, organized resistance across the southern plains is collapsing. Groups increasingly make their way toward reservation agencies because continued independence has become materially unsustainable. The warriors have not forgotten how to ride. They have not forgotten the rivers, hunting grounds, or strategies developed across generations. Their skills remain. The world supporting those skills has been dismantled around them. As spring approaches, another rider turns toward the reservation. His horse carries little. Behind him lies a landscape containing family memories stretching across generations of hunting, trading, warfare, diplomacy, childhood, grief, and movement. Ahead waits an uncertain future. The final surrender era has arrived, but surrender will not mean disappearance. The rider continues toward the reservation because there are now few practical alternatives left. Behind him, the southern plains still stretch beneath the same immense sky. But the world his grandparents knew has changed beyond recognition. Buffalo herds have collapsed, military campaigns have broken resistance, and the freedom created by enormous horse herds has been severely reduced. In 1875, the final organized groups resisting reservation confinement begin coming in. Among the most famous leaders associated with this closing period is Quanah Parker, whose followers had remained beyond reservation control during the Red River War. In June 1875, Quanah and his group arrived at Fort Sill, marking one of the symbolic endpoints of independent Comanche resistance on the southern plains. There is no single dramatic surrender shared by every Comanche person. Families had already arrived at different times. Some had accepted reservation life earlier, while others resisted longer. Political independence therefore closes through many individual decisions rather than one ceremonial moment. That distinction is important. Modern historians studying the American West at institutions including Yale, Stanford, the University of Oklahoma, and the University of Texas generally emphasize this complexity. The end of armed resistance was a process shaped by military pressure, ecological collapse, hunger, diplomacy, and changing choices within native communities. No single battlefield explains it. Historians still debate how these forces should be weighted. Some interpretations emphasize the destruction of buffalo as the decisive economic blow. Others place greater attention upon sustained military campaigning, settlement, disease, reservation policy, and the destruction of horse herds. The strongest interpretation allows these pressures to interact. You can feel their combined weight as families arrive near Fort Sill. Wagons, military buildings, livestock, soldiers, government employees, and other native communities create a landscape very different from the mobile camps of earlier generations. Dust hangs over heavily travelled ground. Horses stand near fences rather than disappearing freely across distant grazing country. Government buildings impose straight lines upon a world once organized largely through rivers, seasons, grass, and movement. Everything feels constrained. A child looks toward the buildings with curiosity. An older relative looks toward them differently. For the child, this place may become part of ordinary memory. For the elder, every permanent structure can emphasize how much mobility has been lost. That generational difference becomes central to survival. The reservation system attempts to transform Comanche economic and social life. Federal authorities encourage agriculture, fixed residence, schooling, and dependence upon government distributions. The policies reflect a broader assimilation program. Officials often believe native culture should be replaced by American social practices rather than preserved as independent systems. For Comanche families, adaptation becomes unavoidable. Adaptation does not mean passive acceptance. People maintain family relationships, cultural knowledge, memories, and forms of identity even while navigating institutions designed to change them. Some practices become harder to sustain, others transform. A society built around buffalo hunting and broad seasonal mobility cannot continue unchanged after buffalo disappear and movement becomes restricted. Yet people remain. That is the essential distinction. Older frontier narratives sometimes treated the end of armed resistance as though Comanche history itself had ended. Such storytelling quietly removes living people from the story once they stop fighting soldiers. History does not work that way. The warrior becomes a father on the reservation. The hunter becomes a negotiator. The leader who once organized resistance may learn to work through government offices, cattle markets, legal disputes, and political relationships. Skills change their expression. Quanah Parker provides a striking example. After surrender, he becomes an influential leader during the reservation period and develops relationships with American officials, ranchers, and prominent visitors. His later life demonstrates how leadership could adapt from military resistance toward political and economic negotiation. This transformation should not be mistaken for forgetting. A person can adapt without erasing memory. Quanah's prominence also illustrates another continuing reality of Comanche politics. Leadership still depends substantially upon reputation, relationships, persuasion, and the ability to navigate changing circumstances. The environment has changed. The importance of judgment has not. You sit near a reservation dwelling during a cold evening. Wood smoke drifts sideways beneath a steady wind, carrying a smell familiar from countless earlier camps. An elderly man warms his fingers while younger relatives listen nearby. Perhaps he describes buffalo. The children have seen scattered animals, but they cannot easily imagine herds covering the plains almost beyond sight. He explains the sound. Thousands of hooves once produced a low rolling thunder across the ground. Dust could rise above moving animals until the horizon itself seemed disturbed. The children listen. Memory carries what the landscape no longer can. That transmission becomes another kind of resistance. Names, family histories, horsemanship, stories, social relationships, and knowledge of country survive because people continue teaching them. The warrior legacy therefore passes into cultural memory. It also survives through historical records produced by former enemies. American soldiers repeatedly acknowledge Comanche mobility and riding skill, even when their descriptions contain prejudice or exaggeration. Mexican records preserve evidence of the enormous geographical reach of 19th century raids. Spanish documents reveal something equally important. Long before American conquest, colonial officials had already learned that Comanche power required diplomacy as well as warfare. Taken together, these records trace an extraordinary transformation. Around 1700, the ancestors of the Comanche are moving southward, while horses reshape their possibilities. Within generations, mounted communities become major powers across the southern plains. They challenge Apache dominance in important regions. They negotiate with Spain. They influence New Mexico. They raid deep into Mexico. They resist Texas settlement. They confront the expanding United States. Their rise is remarkably fast. Their independent mounted world lasts for generations, long enough for children to inherit skills their grandparents helped develop. Then the conditions supporting that world collapse with extraordinary speed. Disease reduces population. Settlement compresses territory. Military campaigns destroy camps and horse herds. Commercial hunters devastate buffalo populations. Industrial resources strengthen opponents capable of replacing losses far more easily. By 1875, the balance has become impossible to restore. Yet describing this simply as technological superiority would miss much of the history. The United States succeeds partly because it can transform the environment of conflict. Railroads, markets, settlers, forts, hunters, and military campaigns work together, intentionally or otherwise, to eliminate the geographic freedom upon which Comanche independence depends. Space itself changes politically. Remember the plains you first entered. There were few fixed obstacles. A family facing danger could move toward another river, another hunting ground, another stretch of grazing country. Movement created resilience. By 1875, movement is increasingly restricted by settlements, military power, reservation boundaries, and ecological devastation. The horse remains magnificent. There are simply fewer places it can carry independence. For a moment, your mind drifts backward through everything you have seen. You hear the first soft hoofbeats of mounted communities moving southward. You remember children learning to ride. You see buffalo spreading across the horizon, traders examining horses, warriors scouting distant ridges, and families working beside evening fires. You remember Spanish officials staring at maps. You remember Mexican settlements waiting nervously for reports from the north. You remember Texas roads turning slowly from muddy tracks into permanent corridors of settlement. And you remember the empty plains after the Buffalo collapse. The story becomes less about constant warfare than adaptation across changing worlds. Comanche warriors were formidable because they belonged to a society exceptionally suited to the southern plains. Their horsemanship mattered because it connected hunting, economics, warfare, communication, and family mobility. Their decentralization mattered because it provided flexibility. Their environmental knowledge mattered because distance could become protection. Their trade networks mattered because independence still required exchange. None of those strengths existed separately. Together they created one of the most powerful mounted societies in North American history. The phrase "ruled the southern plains" can therefore be understood carefully. Comanche people did not rule through a centralized government administering every settlement inside fixed borders. Their dominance operated through mobility, military strength, economic influence, diplomacy, reputation, and control over access across enormous spaces. That power was real, so were its limits. Neighboring native peoples continued pursuing their own interests. Spanish, Mexican, Texan, and American communities resisted Comanche influence, negotiated with it, and sometimes exploited divisions within it. History remains crowded with competing perspectives. That complexity makes the story richer. You no longer see anonymous warriors racing endlessly across a romantic frontier. You see people returning home tired, parents worrying about children, traders calculating value, leaders weighing uncertain choices, and families adapting to forces nobody fully controls. You also see endurance. Comanche people didn't vanish in 1875. Their descendants continued building communities, preserving identity, maintaining cultural traditions, and interpreting their own history through generations that followed. The modern Comanche nation remains a living native nation today. That fact changes how the ending feels. You're not standing beside the grave of a vanished people. You're reaching the end of one historical era in a much longer human story. Night settles across the plains once more. Horsebreath rises into cold air, briefly visible before disappearing beneath the stars, somewhere near the fire. An older voice finishes a story while younger listeners remain quiet. The prairie wind continues beyond them. Perhaps that is where this journey should leave you. Not with the sound of a final battle, but with memory passing between generations. You have crossed 175 years of transformation. You watched horses help create extraordinary mobility, buffalo sustain an expanding economy, trade connect distant worlds, and warriors project power across immense distances. You also watched those foundations collapse. Yet the people carrying the memory survived. And as the fire burns lower, the great distances of the southern plains become quiet again. If this journey stayed with you tonight, I would love to know which part of the Comanche story you found most fascinating. Perhaps it was their extraordinary horsemanship, the buffalo economy, their long-distance raids, or the diplomacy that allowed them to negotiate with competing powers for generations. Share your favourite moment in the comments, along with anything you would like us to explore more deeply. These histories become more meaningful when we can reflect on them together, and when you are ready for another quiet journey into the past, there is another story waiting for you here on the channel. You can follow it whenever the evening feels right, and we will cross another forgotten landscape together. Until then, rest comfortably, let the last hoofbeats fade into the distance, and carry a little of this remarkable history with you into the night.